My name is Nia, and at 31 years old, I never told my boyfriend that I earned $120,000 a month. He had always seen me living a simple life, assuming my organic skincare company was just a cute little hobby. When he finally invited me to an exclusive dinner at his parents' sprawling mansion, I wanted to see how his high society family would treat someone they thought was broke. But the moment I walked through the heavy oak doors, his mother did not even say hello. She looked at my thrift store dress with utter disgust, shoved a catering apron into my hands, and told me to go to the kitchen. When I looked at my boyfriend for defense, he simply told me to earn my place. He had no idea that I held the power to destroy his entire family legacy. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who severely underestimated your worth. The warning signs had been there since the beginning of my relationship with Terrence. He was 33 years old, working as a mid-level manager at a logistics firm, but he carried himself like he owned the entire city of Atlanta. We met at a coffee shop in Midtown, and his charm was undeniable. However, as the months passed, his obsession with status and appearances became suffocating. He constantly bragged about his family, boasting that they were the epitome of black excellence. His father, Winston, was a senior partner at a prestigious law firm, and his mother, Valerie, was a prominent socialite who practically ran the local country club. Terrence made sure I knew exactly how elite his bloodline was, while consistently minimizing my own accomplishments. I let him believe whatever he wanted. The truth was, dating as a successful woman in Atlanta had brought me nothing but opportunists and gold diggers. Men who found out I was the founder and chief executive officer of Obsidian Holdings suddenly stopped trying to build a partnership and started looking for a payday. So when I met Terrence, I kept my life deliberately modest. I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic. I lived in an unassuming apartment. When he asked what I did for a living, I told him I mixed homemade hair and skin lotions. I never mentioned that those lotions generated $50 million in revenue last year, or that my venture capital division was currently dominating the market. I wanted a man who loved me, not for my bank account. The drive to his parents' estate in Buckhead was tense. Terrence had insisted on driving my aging Honda because his luxury sedan was supposedly in the shop. He spent the entire 40-minute car ride giving me a lecture on high society etiquette. He criticized my simple floral dress, suggesting I should have opened a credit card to buy something more appropriate. He warned me not to speak unless spoken to, not to use the wrong fork, and above all, not to embarrass him in front of his parents' elite guests. He explained that tonight was not just a family dinner, but a critical networking event that could dictate the future of his father's law firm. Every condescending word he spoke chipped away at my affection for him, replacing it with a cold, analytical clarity. We pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of the estate. The mansion was an imposing structure of brick and glass surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns and luxury vehicles parked along the circular driveway. Terrence parked my humble car as far away from the entrance as possible, clearly ashamed of it. As we walked up the sweeping stone steps to the front doors, he aggressively straightened his tie and hissed at me to stand up straight. I maintained my calm demeanor, curious to see exactly what kind of people raised a man so obsessed with superficial validation. The heavy oak door swung open before Terrence could even ring the bell. Valerie stood in the foyer, dripping in expensive pearls and wearing a perfectly tailored designer suit. Her face was a mask of aristocratic severity. She did not offer a warm smile or a motherly embrace. Instead, her eyes swept over me from head to toe, cataloging every detail of my inexpensive dress and sensible shoes. Her expression settled into one of absolute disgust, as if Terrence had just tracked mud onto her pristine marble floors. Terrence smiled brightly and stepped forward. "Mom, you look beautiful. This is Nia, the woman I have been telling you about." Valerie ignored his greeting entirely. She did not say hello. She did not ask about my day. She reached behind the door and pulled out a stained white catering apron. Without a word of introduction, she shoved the coarse fabric directly into my hands. "The catering staff is severely short-handed tonight," Valerie stated, her voice sharp and commanding. "Put this on and head straight through that hallway to the kitchen. We are hosting very important elite guests this evening, and I will not have you ruining the aesthetics of my dining room looking like that." I stood frozen on the threshold, the rough fabric of the apron resting in my palms. The sheer audacity of her demand echoed in the grand foyer. I had prepared myself for snobbery or subtle microaggressions, but this blatant degradation was beyond anything I had anticipated. She was literally ordering her son's girlfriend to act as unpaid domestic help just because she disapproved of my outfit. I slowly turned my head to look at Terrence. I waited for the man I had dated for months to step between me and his mother. I waited for him to defend my honor, to tell Valerie that I was his guest and his partner, and that she could not treat me like a servant. I gave him the opportunity to prove that he possessed even a fraction of the character he claimed to have. Instead, Terrence looked nervously at his mother, completely shrinking under her dominant presence. He refused to meet my eyes. He leaned in close to my ear and whispered, his voice laced with annoyance rather than support. "Just do it, Naya. My family is high society. You need to earn your place here. You know how important this night is for my dad. Just put the apron on and help out. Do not make a scene and embarrass me." The betrayal was swift and absolute. His words confirmed everything I needed to know. He was a coward who valued his mother's toxic approval over my basic human dignity. He had spent months mocking my business, referring to it as a cute little hobby, and now he was explicitly telling me that my only value in this house was manual labor. He genuinely believed I was a broke, naive woman who should be grateful just to breathe the same air as his wealthy family. A hot flash of anger surged through my chest, but I quickly suppressed it. I did not cry. I did not yell. Decades of navigating the ruthless corporate world had taught me that emotional outbursts gave away your power. I realized in that moment that I did not want to storm out and end the relationship on the front porch. I wanted to see this through. I wanted to witness the full extent of their arrogance. I wanted them to show me every ugly, prejudiced corner of their personalities before I burned their perfect facade to the ground. I looked at Terrence, offering him a blank, unreadable smile. Then I looked at Valerie, who was tapping her manicured fingers impatiently against the door frame. "Of course," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly polite. "I would be happy to help out in the kitchen. I certainly would not want to ruin the aesthetic of your beautiful home." Valerie scoffed, clearly taking my compliance as a sign of weakness and submission. "Good. At least you know how to take direction. The kitchen is past the dining room. Do not touch any of the food meant for the VIP guests and try not to get in the way of the professionals." I unfolded the white apron and tied the strings securely around my waist. The symbolism was not lost on me. They thought they were putting me in my place, forcing the poor girlfriend into a role of servitude. They thought they held all the power because they owned a big house and drove expensive cars. They had absolutely no idea that the woman tying that apron was a venture capitalist who could buy their entire estate with a single phone call. Without another word to Terrence, I walked past them and stepped into the sprawling mansion. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the expensive artwork and antique furniture lining the hallway. I could hear the sounds of clinking glass and polite laughter coming from the formal dining room ahead. I kept my posture straight and my head held high as I walked toward the back of the house. I was entering the kitchen as a servant, but I knew exactly how I would be leaving this house by the end of the night. The game had just begun, and the rules were entirely mine to write. As I pushed open the swinging doors to the kitchen, the chaos of a high-end catering operation hit me. Chefs were shouting orders, servers were rushing past with silver trays, and the smell of roasted meats and expensive truffles filled the air. I found an empty corner near the prep station and took a deep breath. My phone vibrated in my pocket, likely a message from my chief financial officer regarding a pending acquisition. I ignored it for now. Terrence and his mother wanted to play a game of class and status, completely unaware that they had just handed a uniform to their worst nightmare. I rolled up my sleeves, ready to play the part perfectly, until the time came to deliver a reality check they would never forget. The head chef, a visibly exhausted woman tightly clutching a metal clipboard, pointed me toward a stainless steel prep station piled high with miniature toast points and glass jars of imported caviar. She instantly assumed I was a late arrival from the local catering agency. I did not correct her assumption. I picked up a delicate silver spoon and began assembling the appetizers with mechanical, deliberate precision. The repetitive physical motion gave me the mental space to calmly calculate my next move. Within 10 minutes, the heavy kitchen doors swung open again. Valerie marched into the room, the sharp clacking of her designer heels demanding immediate attention from every single worker. She completely bypassed the head chef and walked directly toward my station. Her dark eyes narrowed like a hawk inspecting a severely flawed piece of meat. "Are you piling entirely too much caviar on those blinis?" Valerie asked, her harsh voice easily cutting through the ambient noise of the bustling kitchen. "We are serving the absolute elite of Atlanta tonight. Real wealth understands the fine art of subtlety. Not that I would ever expect someone from your lowly background to grasp the concept of proper portion control." I kept my hands perfectly steady, placing a meticulously measured dollop of caviar onto the next toast point. "I am simply following the head chef's visual guide, Valerie," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even and entirely respectful. "You will address me as Mrs. Vance while you are wearing that apron in my house," she snapped back instantly. She leaned against the cold edge of the prep table, clearly intent on tormenting me while simultaneously supervising the hired kitchen staff. "Terrence tells me you went to some generic public state university. Is that information correct?" I did not look up from my meticulous work. I attended a state school for my undergraduate degree, yes. It provided a very solid foundation for my career. Valerie let out a dry, heavily condescending laugh. "A solid foundation for mixing homemade lotions in your bathtub, I suppose. In this family, we value actual pedigree and historical legacy. I am a third-generation Spelman College graduate. My grandmother walked those revered halls. My mother walked those halls. I walked those halls. We belong to the oldest, most prestigious sororities in this entire country. We build lasting legacies. We do not just scrape by on minimal effort and cheap public education." She picked up a finished appetizer, inspected it critically from multiple angles, and placed it aggressively back on the silver tray. "Terrence is destined for incredible greatness. He is supposed to marry a highly educated woman who truly understands the heavy weight of our family name. A woman who brings substantial capital, deep political connections, and undeniable class to the table. You bring absolutely nothing but a sad little hobby and a thrift store wardrobe. I am only letting you stay here tonight because I desperately want you to see what real success actually looks like. I want you to witness firsthand the high caliber of people my son is actually meant to associate with in his daily life." Every single word she spoke was strategically designed to make me feel incredibly small, to constantly remind me that I was a worthless outsider, infiltrating her carefully curated bubble of Black excellence. But her overwhelming arrogance was completely blinding her to reality. She was bragging about historical pedigree while her own son was secretly begging me for petty cash loans to cover his basic monthly expenses. I logged her aggressive comments in my mind, treating her blatant insults like raw data in a corporate financial audit. I remained completely silent. Before Valerie could launch into another lengthy monologue about her elite sorority sisters, the kitchen doors swung open with aggressive force. Chloe strutted into the room, bringing with her the overwhelming, suffocating scent of a heavy, overpriced floral perfume. At 29 years old, Terrence's younger sister was a walking billboard for deep financial insecurity masked as high fashion. She wore a skin-tight designer dress that looked uncomfortably restrictive, her wrists heavily stacked with thick gold bangles that clinked loudly with every exaggerated movement she made. "Mom, the caterers are taking entirely too long with the champagne refills in the main room," Chloe complained, marching directly toward the large industrial refrigerators. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me standing quietly at the prep station wearing the stained white apron. A cruel, delighted smile slowly spread across her heavily contoured face. "Well, look exactly what the stray cat dragged into the kitchen," Chloe said, her voice dripping with venomous, unchecked amusement. "Terrence told me you were coming tonight, but I had absolutely no idea Mom was putting you to hard work. Honestly, it suits you perfectly. You look much more natural handling raw food in the back than trying to sit at a formal table with our distinguished guests." Chloe, leave the hired help to their assigned tasks, Valerie said smoothly, though the highly satisfied smirk on her face proved she was immensely enjoying her daughter's cruel bullying tactics. We have a very important evening ahead of us, and we cannot afford any foolish distractions. Chloe grabbed a freshly opened bottle of expensive vintage champagne from a nearby silver ice bucket. She poured herself a tall glass, intentionally filling it right up to the absolute brim. As she turned her body back toward my station, her eyes dropped deliberately to my sensible black shoes. Without breaking direct eye contact with me, she slightly tilted her glass, a heavy splash of cold, sticky champagne poured directly onto the pristine kitchen tile floor, splashing violently onto the toe of my right shoe. Oops, Chloe said, her voice completely flat and entirely unapologetic. My hand just slipped. You better clean that up quickly, Nia. We cannot have the actual catering staff slipping and ruining the entire dinner service. There should be a dirty mop in the utility closet over there in the corner. I stared down at the growing puddle of golden champagne rapidly seeping into the white grout between the floor tiles. I looked back up at Chloe's incredibly smug expression, then over at Valerie, who was watching me with hawkish, predatory intensity, waiting eagerly to see if I would finally break down crying. They desperately wanted tears. They wanted a massive temper tantrum. They wanted me to yell and scream loudly so they could instantly validate their false narrative that I was an unhinged, low-class woman entirely unfit for their precious son. Instead, I reached over for a thick stack of industrial paper towels resting on the stainless steel counter. I knelt down gracefully on the cold tile floor and began wiping up the intentionally spilled champagne. I moved methodically and carefully, absorbing the sticky liquid feeling, the intense coldness soak rapidly through the thin paper and touch my bare skin. Good girl, Chloe sneered loudly, looking down her nose at me as I actively scrubbed the floor directly at her feet. It is very good to know your precise place in this world. You know, my highly successful husband, Dr. Julian, always says that ordinary people truly need to understand their specific rank in the social hierarchy. Society simply functions much better that way when everyone stays exactly where they belong. I threw the soaked paper towels heavily into a nearby trash bin and grabbed a fresh dry stack to finish wiping the damp tiles. I kept my head bowed down, but my ears were wide open and highly alert to every single word being spoken above me. Is Dr. Julian arriving soon? Valerie asked, her tone instantly shifting from utterly condescending to sickeningly adoring and respectful. He is on his way right now, Chloe boasted loudly, ensuring every single kitchen worker heard her distinct words. He had a very late consultation at the clinic. You know exactly how incredibly demanding it is to run the premier plastic surgery center in Atlanta. Julian is practically a medical miracle worker for the elite members of this city. His private patient roster is completely exclusive. Professional athletes, prominent politicians, reality television stars. The clinic consistently brings in millions of dollars, and he is the sole chief of surgery. We are actually looking at buying a second luxury vacation home in Aspen next month because our primary house is getting slightly boring. I wiped the very last drops of champagne from the floor and stood back up, tossing the remaining paper towels away into the garbage bin. I washed my hands thoroughly at the stainless steel sink, meticulously scrubbing away the sticky alcohol residue while permanently committing every single detail Chloe just aggressively revealed to my sharp memory. Dr. Julian. The premier plastic surgery center in Atlanta, a supposed multi-million-dollar medical enterprise run by a single prominent surgeon. I knew the commercial medical business sector intimately well. Obsidian Holdings maintained a massive dedicated healthcare investment wing that meticulously tracked regional revenue and outstanding clinical debts. If Julian's private clinic was truly as massively successful as Chloe confidently claimed, his specific name would have definitely crossed my desk during our routine quarterly market evaluations. It absolutely had not. In my extensive corporate experience dealing with wealthy individuals, the fragile people who bragged the loudest about their immense wealth in front of blue-collar service workers were usually the exact ones drowning the deepest in massive hidden financial debt. True generational wealth whispers quietly in the background. Fake desperate wealth screams loudly for external validation. and this entire family was screaming at the absolute top of their lungs, desperate to prove their undeniable worth to absolutely anyone who would simply stand still and listen to their endless, pathetic boasting. Julian is a truly brilliant man, Valerie agreed warmly, patting Chloe's arm with deep maternal affection. He is the exact standard Terrence constantly needs to match. This entire family is heavily built on absolute professional prestige. Elite corporate lawyers, top-tier medical doctors, powerful executives. That is our exclusive inner circle. We do not ever dilute our strong bloodline with lazy people who completely lack ambition and drive. Chloe took a long sip of her expensive champagne and looked me up and down one final harshly judging time. Exactly. That is exactly why tonight is so unbelievably crucial for us. Winston has everything lined up perfectly with the new investors. We just need to smoothly execute the final business plan. She turned her back to me, completely dismissing my presence in the room yet again. Is she here yet, the true guest of honor? She will be arriving at any moment, Valerie said, her eyes gleaming with a strange, predatory excitement. Winston is waiting patiently in the grand foyer to receive her properly. Once she is inside the house, I want this kitchen running like a well-oiled machine. No mistakes whatsoever. Do not worry, Mom. Chloe laughed cruelly, turning her body toward the heavy swinging doors. I am absolutely sure Nia will do a fantastic job making sure the tiny appetizers look somewhat pretty. It is clearly the absolute limit of her mental capabilities anyway. They proudly walked out of the kitchen together, their synchronized laughter echoing briefly before the heavy wooden doors swung shut abruptly, cutting off the harsh sound. I returned to my prep station completely unfazed by their juvenile theatrical display. I picked up the silver spoon and resumed placing the imported caviar onto the tiny toast points. My mind was racing, analyzing every piece of valuable intelligence they had just carelessly handed over to me. They were planning a major financial merger tonight. They were relying heavily on a mystery guest of honor to secure their family's prestigious legacy. They firmly believed they held all the absolute power in the room, simply because they wore expensive designer clothing and spoke with unearned, arrogant authority. I smiled down at the beautiful tray of appetizers, feeling a cold, calculating calmness completely wash over me. The grand stage was finally set. The arrogant actors were blindly playing their assigned parts perfectly, and I held the ultimate script. The chime of the heavy brass doorbell echoed through the sprawling mansion, piercing the chaotic hum of the kitchen. It was a sharp, demanding sound that instantly brought the catering staff to a halt. The head chef frantically waved her hands, gesturing for me to grab the heavy silver tray of caviar blinis I had just finished preparing. I balanced the tray on my palm, pushed through the heavy swinging wooden doors, and stepped out into the opulent dining room, just as Winston Vance's booming theatrical voice filled the grand foyer. Winston was 62 years old, a senior partner at a supposedly untouchable law firm, and he carried himself with the bloated self-importance of a man who believed the world revolved entirely around his bank accounts. I stood silently near the archway, holding the heavy tray perfectly positioned to witness the grand arrival. The massive oak front doors were wide open. Standing on the marble threshold was Serena. At 30 years old, she was the highly publicized daughter of one of Atlanta's most ruthless real estate tycoons. I recognized her immediately from various business publications and charity gala photographs that frequently crossed my desk at Obsidian Holdings. She was draped in an aggressively expensive emerald green silk gown, carrying a rare limited edition designer bag that cost more than most people earned in an entire year. She dripped with old money arrogance, walking into the house not as a guest, but as an acquiring monarch surveying her new territory. Winston stepped forward, spreading his arms wide with a sickeningly eager smile that showcased his expensive dental veneers. "Serena, my absolute dear." Winston projected loudly, ensuring his voice carried through the entire house. "Welcome to our home. You look absolutely radiant this evening. Your father sends his best regards, I presume." Serena offered a practiced, tight-lipped smile, extending a hand adorned with massive diamonds. "He does, Winston. He expects a full report on tonight's dinner. Right on cue, Valerie rushed past Winston, practically shoving her husband aside to get to Serena. Valerie reached out and pulled the younger woman into an exaggerated, tight embrace, completely ignoring the fact that Serena looked visibly stiff and uncomfortable with the physical contact. "Oh, Serena, darling!" Valerie gushed, her voice pitching up an entire octave into a fake, breathy tone. "We are just so unbelievably thrilled you are here. I was just telling the rest of the family how much we adore you. You are truly the perfect future daughter-in-law." I felt my grip tighten slightly on the edges of the silver tray. The cold metal pressed sharply into my skin. The perfect future daughter-in-law. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Valerie had not whispered it as a secret desire. She had proclaimed it loudly, proudly, and intentionally in a room full of people. I was Terrence's official girlfriend of 8 months. He had introduced me to his friends, brought me to his work events, and told me he saw a permanent future with me. Yet here was his mother openly declaring another woman as his future wife, while I stood 15 feet away, dressed like a hired servant. I did not feel a sudden crushing wave of heartbreak. Instead, I felt a sharp, clarifying, icy focus settle deep into my chest. The pathetic puzzle pieces were rapidly snapping into perfect alignment. This entire dinner was not a simple family gathering to test the new girlfriend. It was a high-stakes corporate merger disguised as a social event, and I was merely a pawn they thought they could humiliate for sport. I shifted my gaze from Valerie to the grand staircase descending into the foyer. Terrence was walking down the steps wearing a tailored charcoal suit that I knew he had put on a credit card he could barely afford to pay off. He looked incredibly handsome, polished, and completely devoid of a single ounce of moral integrity. He walked straight toward Serena, bypassing his parents, and approached her with an easy, confident swagger. He did not look around the room to see where I was. He did not scan the area to check if I was comfortable. He knew exactly where his mother had banished me, and he did not care. "Serena, you look stunning," Terrence said, his voice dropping into a low, intimate register that he usually reserved entirely for me. He stepped deeply into her personal space, placed his hand firmly on her waist, and leaned in to press a lingering, highly intimate kiss against her cheek. Serena accepted the kiss naturally, leaning into his touch as if this was a deeply established routine between them. It was not a greeting between mere family friends or casual business associates. It was a clear, undeniable display of romantic ownership. Terrence was actively courting her. He pulled back, keeping his hand resting comfortably on the small of her back, and turned to face the dining room. That was when his eyes finally met mine. I was standing perfectly still under the crystal chandelier, the white catering apron tied tightly around my waist, holding the tray of appetizers. I stared directly into his soul. For a fraction of a second, raw panic flashed across Terrence's face. His jaw clenched and his eyes darted nervously between me and Serena. I waited for him to speak. I gave him one final silent opportunity to act like a man, to step away from Serena, to walk over to me, to introduce me as his girlfriend, and to demand that his mother treat me with basic respect. But Terrence simply swallowed hard, looked away from me, and turned his full attention back to the wealthy real estate heiress standing by his side. He actively chose his cowardly deception over my basic dignity. Serena followed Terrence's brief line of sight and noticed me standing near the archway. Her dark eyes swept over my thrift store dress, my sensible shoes, and the stained white apron. She did not see a rival. She did not see a girlfriend. She saw exactly what Valerie had intended for her to see. She saw a low-level worker existing entirely beneath her notice. Serena let out a tired, dramatic sigh, clearly bored by the mere presence of the hired help. "You there," Serena called out, snapping her fingers sharply in my direction. Her voice was dripping with elite entitlement. "Take this heavy coat to the cloakroom. And then I want you to go down to the wine cellar. Winston told me he acquired a 1996 vintage Bordeaux. Fetch it, decant it properly, and bring it to the main table immediately. Do not keep me waiting. I have had an incredibly long day dealing with incompetent people." I stood perfectly still. The silence in the room became incredibly thick. Winston and Valerie watched me with bated breath, eager to see if I would cause a scene and prove their narrative that I was an unhinged, emotional woman who could not handle the pressure of high society. Terence stood frozen like a cowardly statue, absolutely refusing to intervene, silently begging me with his wide, panicked eyes to just play along and disappear into the background. He was completely willing to let another woman treat me like a stray dog, just to secure his own financial future and maintain his pathetic web of lies. I looked at Serena's outstretched hand, pointing dismissively toward the hallway, and then down at the heavy silver tray I was holding. A slow, chilling smile formed on my lips. I was not angry. I was intensely invigorated. They were freely handing me the exact ammunition I needed to completely destroy their fragile, heavily mortgaged empire. By attempting to crush my spirit, they were simply exposing the massive, gaping vulnerabilities in their own armor. I gave Serena a polite, deferential nod, matching her arrogant energy with absolute, unbreakable calmness. "Right away, ma'am," I replied smoothly, ensuring my voice was loud enough for Terence to hear every single syllable. "I will handle the wine perfectly. I certainly would not want to disappoint the perfect future daughter-in-law on such an important evening." Terence flinched physically at my words, his face draining of all remaining color. Valerie narrowed her eyes, sensing the subtle mockery in my tone, but unable to openly call it out without causing the exact scene she was desperately trying to avoid. I turned around gracefully and walked back toward the kitchen, my posture completely unbroken and my head held high. I was heading towards the cellar to fetch their expensive wine, but my mind was already racing miles ahead. The betrayal was no longer just a suspicion. It was a confirmed, undeniable fact playing out right in front of my eyes. Terence was running a dual life, banking his entire future on my continued silence and Serena's deep pockets. I pushed back through the heavy wooden doors into the chaotic kitchen, placing the silver tray onto an empty counter. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold, hard edges of my phone. It was time to start digging into the Vance family finances. The dinner was about to begin, and I was going to serve them a reality check they could never afford to pay. The catering staff rushed past me, completely oblivious to the massive corporate warfare quietly brewing in the center of the kitchen. I wiped my hands on the stained apron, feeling a deep sense of absolute power wash over my entire body. They thought I was a naive woman, easily manipulated by grand displays of wealth. They had absolutely no idea that I spent my entire career dismantling deceitful businessmen just like Terence and Winston. The game was escalating, and I was fully prepared to watch them lose everything they valued. I navigated the twisting stone steps down into the dimly lit wine cellar, the cool air biting at my bare arms. The space was heavily climate-controlled and lined with mahogany racks holding hundreds of expensive bottles. It took me less than a minute to locate the 1996 vintage Bordeaux Serena had so arrogantly demanded. I carefully uncorked the bottle, poured the dark red liquid into a heavy crystal decanter to let it breathe, and placed it perfectly center on my silver tray. My heart beat with a steady, unbothered rhythm. I was not a victim trapped in a nightmare. I was an undercover auditor actively assessing a morally bankrupt enterprise. I pushed back through the swinging doors and entered the grand dining room. The massive table was fully set, draped in pristine white linen, and crowded with sparkling crystal goblets. Winston sat at the head of the table like a bloated king holding court. Valerie sat at the opposite end, constantly adjusting her pearl necklace to ensure the light caught it perfectly. Terence and Serena sat shoulder to shoulder on the right side of the table, their body language entirely too intimate for two people who were supposedly just family friends. Chloe sat on the left, aggressively typing on her phone with her long, heavily manicured nails. I approached the table with the decanter moving silently across the thick Persian rug. Valerie immediately snapped her fingers in my direction, pointing sharply toward the far darkened corner of the large dining room. "You will not be sitting at the main table with us tonight," Valerie announced loudly, ensuring every single person in the room stopped talking to witness my public humiliation. "I have set up a special place for you over there by the serving cart." We have serious family business to discuss, and we simply cannot have the hired help eavesdropping or cluttering the visual space. I looked toward the dark corner Valerie was pointing at. Placed directly next to a drafty air conditioning vent and a pile of dirty serving trays was a small, wobbly wooden stool. There was no table setting. There was no silverware. There was not even a proper chair back for support. It was a literal timeout corner, designed to strip away every last ounce of my human dignity. I slowly turned my eyes toward Terrence. He was currently reaching for his water glass, intentionally looking down at the table linen to avoid making eye contact with me. He did not say a single word in my defense. He did not object to his girlfriend being forced to eat dinner on a broken stool in the shadows while he sat next to a wealthy heiress. His absolute silence was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. I offered Valerie a brief, perfectly polite nod. I set the heavy crystal decanter gently on the center of the main table and walked over to the wooden stool. I sat down quietly in the corner, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I was perfectly comfortable observing them from a distance. A general always prefers a wide vantage point of the battlefield. Just as the first course of roasted quail was being served by the actual catering staff, the heavy front doors slammed shut, echoing down the hallway. Heavy, rapid footsteps approached the dining room. Dr. Julian burst through the archway, completely disrupting the formal atmosphere. Terrence's brother-in-law looked entirely unhinged. His expensive tailored suit jacket was wrinkled, his designer tie was loosened, and a visible sheen of panicked sweat coated his forehead. He was gripping his cell phone so tightly his knuckles were completely white. "Sorry I am late," Julian announced, his voice carrying a frantic, breathless edge that he desperately tried to mask with his usual towering arrogance. I had an absolute nightmare of a case at the clinic. These wealthy socialites demand absolute perfection, and fixing their botched faces takes a massive toll on my precious time. He pulled out the chair next to Chloe and collapsed heavily into it, immediately grabbing his wine glass and downing the contents in one aggressive gulp. Chloe patted his arm, completely oblivious to the raw desperation radiating from her husband. She looked at Serena with a proud, beaming smile. "Julian is simply in high demand," Chloe bragged loudly. "Running the most elite medical facility in the state means he barely has time to breathe. We are basically drowning in success right now." I watched Julian from my dark corner. He did not look like a man drowning in success. He looked like a man drowning in insurmountable debt. His eyes kept darting nervously toward his phone resting on the table. His leg bounced aggressively under the white linen tablecloth, vibrating with the terrified energy of a cornered animal. My corporate instincts flared. Something catastrophic was happening behind the scenes of his medical practice, and he was using this dinner as a desperate distraction. Winston cleared his throat loudly, commanding the attention of the entire room. He raised his freshly poured glass of Bordeaux toward Serena. "To our highly esteemed guest," Winston declared pompously, "Serena, your presence here tonight honors our deep family legacy. The Vance family has always prided itself on associating exclusively with the absolute highest echelon of society. We build empires. We forge unbreakable alliances. We do not tolerate mediocrity in our ranks." Serena smiled politely, accepting the compliment with the practiced grace of a woman who had been spoon-fed arrogance her entire life. She took a delicate sip of her wine and casually let her eyes drift over to my corner. She looked at me sitting on the wobbly stool with a mixture of profound pity and utter revulsion. Terrence, Serena purred, her voice dripping with sickly sweet condescension. "I must admit, your household staffing choices are highly unusual. That poor girl in the corner looks completely out of place. Did your mother recruit her directly from a homeless shelter?" The entire table fell completely silent. Terrence shifted incredibly uncomfortably in his expensive chair. His face turned a deep shade of crimson red. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was completely paralyzed by his own pathetic cowardice. Chloe saw the perfect opportunity to escalate the bullying and immediately seized it. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands, staring directly at me with a vicious, predatory smile. "Oh, Serena, do not be rude!" Chloe laughed, her voice echoing shrilly in the large room. "Nia is not actually hired help. She is just Terrence's little charity project. Tell us, Nia, since you are sitting so quietly over there. What is it that you actually do for a living? I know Terrence mentioned it once, but I honestly could not be bothered to remember such trivial details. Every single pair of eyes at the main table locked onto me. Winston looked deeply annoyed that I was being addressed at all. Valerie smiled wickedly eager for the impending humiliation. Julian finally stopped checking his phone, welcoming the cruel distraction from his own hidden financial panic. Terrence closed his eyes tightly, silently praying I would just vanish into thin air. I sat perfectly straight on the wobbly stool. I did not fidget. I did not look away. I maintained a steady, polite, completely unbreakable gaze. I sell hair care products, I answered humbly, keeping my voice soft and unassuming. I make them myself and sell them to clients. For 2 agonizingly long seconds, the room was dead silent. Then a massive, explosive wave of cruel laughter erupted from the table. Chloe threw her head back and shrieked with amusement, slapping her hand hard against the mahogany table. Serena let out a delicate, highly practiced chuckle, covering her mouth as if my sheer existence was a hilarious joke. Winston let out a deep, rumbling scoff, shaking his head in profound disgust. Even Valerie joined in, dabbing tears of mirth from her eyes with her expensive linen napkin. Hair care products! Chloe gasped out between bouts of vicious laughter. You mix little shampoos in your sink and try to sell them to your poor friends. Oh my goodness, Terrence, you have truly outdone yourself this time. You brought a literal street vendor to a formal corporate dinner. Julian leaned back in his chair, a nasty superior smirk stretching across his sweaty face. He looked at me with absolute unfiltered disdain. Listen, Nia, Julian mocked loudly, pointing a finger directly at my chest. If things get too tough in the homemade shampoo business, you should really let me know. My clinic aesthetic pinnacle throws away bags of clothing left behind by our wealthy clients after their surgical procedures. I usually donate the garments to the local women's shelter, but I can happily save a few trash bags of charity clothes for you. It would certainly be a massive upgrade from whatever tragic thrift store disaster you are currently wearing. Aesthetic pinnacle. I repeated the name silently in my mind, locking it away into the vault of my memory. It was an incredibly arrogant name for a medical clinic. It was also incredibly easy to search in the corporate registry database. Winston slammed his hand flat onto the table, instantly silencing the lingering laughter. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. Enough of this foolishness! Winston barked, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. This table represents serious institutional power. My law firm, Vance and Associates, exclusively handles multi-million-dollar corporate acquisitions. We dictate the financial flow of this entire state. We advise politicians. We bankrupt our enemies. We do not associate with people who peddle cheap homemade trinkets for spare change. He turned his aggressive glare toward Terrence, his voice dropping into a deadly serious tone. Terrence, you are the future managing partner of Vance and Associates. You are meant to sit at the absolute top of the food chain. You will not drag this family name through the mud by associating with someone who possesses absolutely no capital, no class, and no future. Do you understand me? Terrence swallowed hard, refusing to look in my direction. He nodded quickly like an obedient, terrified child. I understand, Dad. You are completely right. I apologize. I sat on my broken stool in the cold, dark corner of the room. My face remained an impassive, emotionless mask. I did not shed a single tear. I did not offer a single word of defense. I simply listened, processed, and calculated. Vance and Associates, aesthetic pinnacle. They had just willingly handed me the exact names of their fragile, heavily mortgaged empires. Winston proudly boasted about his firm bankrupting enemies, completely unaware that his own financial executioner was currently sitting 10 feet away, silently absorbing every single piece of data required to destroy his life. Julian mocked me with offers of charity clothing, desperately projecting a false image of immense wealth to hide the terrifying reality that his clinic was bleeding money. They thought they had successfully humiliated me. They thought they had firmly put the poor, naive girl back in her miserable place. But they had made a fatal, irreversible miscalculation. They had foolishly assumed that the quiet woman sitting in the corner was completely powerless. I reached my hand deep into the pocket of the stained catering apron and lightly traced the smooth edges of my smartphone. The dinner table interrogation was finally over. It was time for me to start asking my own questions, and I was going to demand the answers in blood. Section 5. 1,500 words. The clinking of silverware against fine china resumed, replacing the heavy silence that Winston had just imposed. The conversation at the main table quickly pivoted back to aggressive bragging and strategic networking. Winston leaned across the massive table, enthusiastically pouring more of the vintage Bordeaux into Serena's crystal glass. He launched into a lengthy, pompous monologue about a recent corporate merger his law firm supposedly orchestrated, throwing around massive financial figures like cheap confetti. Julian nodded along enthusiastically, completely abandoning his earlier panic to play the role of the highly successful medical entrepreneur. Chloe was aggressively agreeing with everything Serena said, practically begging for the wealthy heiress to invite her to exclusive charity galas. And Terrence, the man who had claimed to love me just 24 hours ago, was actively mirroring Serena's body language. He leaned in incredibly close to her, lowering his voice to murmur private jokes that made her giggle delicately. I watched him effortlessly slide into the role of the wealthy, unbothered elite suitor. It was a masterful, sickening performance, but I knew the actual numbers hiding behind his perfectly tailored suit. I knew exactly how fragile his financial reality was, because I was the one secretly propping it up. I decided the time had come to introduce a tiny, highly concentrated dose of reality into their delusional dinner party. I stood up slowly from the wobbly wooden stool in the dark corner of the dining room. I smoothed down the front of my stained catering apron and stepped softly into the warm light of the crystal chandelier. I did not carry a silver tray. I did not bring more expensive wine. I simply walked directly toward the right side of the long mahogany table, stopping exactly between Terrence and Serena. The lively conversation died instantly. Valerie glared at me, her mouth parting in sheer outrage at my blatant insubordination. Winston slammed his heavy silver fork down hard against his porcelain plate. Before either of them could bark an aggressive order, sending me back to my dark corner, I looked directly down into Terrence's panicked eyes. I kept my voice incredibly sweet, perfectly polite, and loud enough for every single person at the table to hear clearly. "Excuse me for interrupting, Terrence," I said, offering him a warm, totally disarming smile. "Since we are all here discussing massive corporate mergers and high-level finances tonight, I figured this would be the perfect time to ask. Did you ever finalize that critical investment for your future? You know, the one you desperately needed the $4,000 for last Tuesday." Terrence froze completely. The color drained so rapidly from his face that he looked physically ill. His eyes darted wildly towards Serena, then to his formidable father, and finally back to me. The sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from his tense body was almost palpable. $4,000 was absolute pocket change to a woman like Serena, but to Terrence it was a desperate lifeline. He had begged me for that exact amount, while crying in my cheap apartment, claiming his luxury car was actively being repossessed by the bank. Now, in front of his wealthy future bride and his incredibly arrogant family, the dark reality of his hidden poverty was suddenly sitting directly on the dinner table. "What on earth are you talking about?" Valerie hissed aggressively, leaning forward so fast she nearly spilled her vintage wine. "Terrence, what is this insolent girl saying?" Terrence pushed his heavy dining chair back violently, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. He stood up abruptly, towering over me, his chest heaving with fabricated outrage. He had exactly two choices in this critical moment. He could confess the embarrassing truth and admit to Serena that he was completely broke, or he could completely destroy my character to save his own miserable skin. He chose exactly what I knew he would choose. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Terrence shouted, his voice echoing sharply against the high ceiling. His handsome face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure vicious disgust. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. You are completely delusional." I stood my ground, my expression remaining completely serene and unbothered. "Oh," I replied softly, my tone dripping with feigned innocence. You do not remember texting me at 2 in the morning last week, begging for a direct bank transfer so you could invest in a crucial networking opportunity. Terrence slammed his hand flat on the table, making the crystal glasses rattle dangerously. You are lying, he roared, his voice cracking with desperate aggressive panic. I never asked you for a single dime. Why would I ever need money from someone who mixes cheap lotions in her bathroom? I am a senior executive at a highly respected logistics firm. I drive a luxury sedan. I live in a high-end condo right here in Buckhead. You are just a desperate, pathetic gold digger trying to extort me in front of my family because you are incredibly jealous of Serena. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, projecting his own horrific financial insecurity entirely onto me. You see the massive wealth at this table, and you think you can just invent a fake loan to shake me down for quick cash. It is absolutely pathetic, Nia. You are clearly mentally unstable. I always knew you were desperate, but trying to scam me for $4,000 in front of my own parents is a brand new low, even for a broke charity case like you. Winston scoffed loudly, shaking his head in profound theatrical disgust. This is exactly what happens when you associate with bottom feeders, Terrence. They see a highly successful black family and immediately look for a pathetic handout. It is a classic, predictable extortion attempt. We deal with these exact types of fraudulent claims at the law firm every single day. These people have absolutely no shame. I will have my senior associates draft a harsh cease and desist order tomorrow morning if she continues this ridiculous harassment. Chloe chimed in, rolling her eyes dramatically. I told you she was a manipulative liar, Terrence. Anyone wearing a thrift store dress to a formal dinner is obviously looking for a quick payday. Julian smirked, nodding in vigorous agreement with his terrible wife. It is honestly sad to watch someone sink this incredibly low just to grab a few $1,000s. Serena leaned back slowly in her expensive chair, crossing her arms tightly over her emerald green silk gown. She looked at me with an expression of supreme, unfiltered contempt. She let out a dry, mocking laugh that cut straight through the heavy tension in the room. Honestly, this is just painfully embarrassing to watch. Serena sneered, her voice dripping with elite entitlement. A woman of your obvious low standing trying to actively extort a highly successful man like Terrence. $4,000. Are you really that desperate for basic rent money? If you needed charity that badly, you should have just asked the catering staff to pack you up some extra leftovers. Do not try to trap a wealthy man with your pathetic imaginary financial claims. It makes you look completely unhinged and utterly classless. Terrence deserves so much better than dealing with this kind of uneducated street trash. I did not break. I did not flinch. I did not let a single tear form in my eyes. I stood there and absorbed every single vicious insult, every bold lie, and every desperate attempt to aggressively gaslight me into total submission. The sheer volume of their collective cruelty was staggering, but it was also incredibly illuminating. They were operating under the false assumption that they held absolute power. I looked directly into Terrence's eyes, staring straight through his expensive tailored suit and his fabricated hollow confidence. I saw the terrified, morally bankrupt little boy desperately hiding underneath that polished fake exterior. He had just publicly branded the loyal woman who secretly financially supported him a desperate thief and a manipulative gold digger solely to protect his fragile, inflated ego. He was entirely willing to sacrifice my reputation to secure his future with Serena. The test was completely over, and he had failed spectacularly. His true character was now permanently exposed in the harsh dining room light. You are absolutely right, Terrence, I finally said, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm, icy whisper. I must have completely imagined the entire transaction. My tired mind must be playing terrible tricks on me. Please accept my sincere apologies for the unnecessary confusion. I truly hope you enjoy the rest of your perfectly elite corporate dinner. I turned away from the table, my posture rigid and completely unbreakable, and began to walk away. The trap was fully set, and the vicious financial gaslighting had confirmed absolutely everything I needed to execute my final plan. Their total, absolute destruction was now becoming truly inevitable. I barely made it past the heavy archway of the dining room before a sharp, manicured hand clamped violently onto my left bicep. The polished acrylic nails dug painfully through the thin fabric of my thrift store dress, pinching my skin with the aggressive, frantic energy of a cornered predator. I stopped walking and looked down at the hand, then slowly traced my gaze up the rigid arm to meet the furious, hyperventilating face of Valerie Vance. Her perfect socialite mask had completely melted away, replaced by the ugly, contorted features of a woman desperately clinging to a crumbling illusion of control. "Do not say another word," Valerie hissed, her voice vibrating with suppressed rage, ensuring the guests in the dining room could not hear her vitriol. "You are coming with me right now." She yanked my arm with surprising physical force, dragging me away from the kitchen and down a dark, heavily paneled corridor. We passed a series of large gilded oil paintings and antique vases placed carefully on narrow pedestals, all designed to project an image of generational wealth that I now knew was entirely fabricated. She did not stop until we reached a set of towering double doors at the very end of the hallway. She shoved the doors open, pulled me inside, and slammed them shut behind us, engaging the heavy brass lock with a loud, definitive click. We were standing in Winston's private study. The room was a suffocating monument to the Vance family ego. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked like they had never actually been opened. A massive, ostentatious crystal chandelier hung directly over a colossal mahogany desk that dominated the center of the room. Framed photographs of Winston shaking hands with local politicians and Valerie posing at exclusive charity galas covered every available inch of surface space. The entire room smelled heavily of expensive Scotch-stale cigar smoke and desperate insecurity. Valerie marched directly behind the massive desk, her chest heaving as she glared at me across the polished mahogany. I remained standing perfectly still near the locked door, my posture relaxed, my hands clasped loosely in front of my stained catering apron. I did not rub my bruised arm. I did not show an ounce of intimidation. I simply watched her unravel. "You incredibly stupid, reckless girl!" Valerie spat, her voice no longer a hushed whisper, but a venomous strike. "What exactly did you think you were accomplishing out there? Did you genuinely believe that inventing some pathetic lie about a $4,000 loan would magically elevate you to our level? Did you think pulling a cheap stunt in front of Serena would make Terrence suddenly realize he belongs with a nobody who mixes cheap lotions for a living?" I remained silent, allowing her to exhaust her frantic energy. My silence only infuriated her more. "Terrence is the future of this entire family," Valerie continued, pacing aggressively behind the desk. "He is brilliant. He is handsome. He has an impeccable pedigree. He is destined to inherit Vance and Associates and steer our family into the next century of absolute elite prosperity. He is not going to throw away a billion-dollar merger just to satisfy the pathetic delusions of a gold-digging street vendor." She stopped pacing and slammed her hands flat against the mahogany desk, leaning heavily toward me. Her eyes were wide, manic, and filled with a terrifyingly shallow arrogance. "Serena is exactly the kind of woman Terrence needs," Valerie declared, her tone absolute. "She brings immense capital. Her father owns half the commercial real estate in Atlanta. Her family has political connections that can elevate Winston to a federal judgeship. A marriage between Terrence and Serena is not just a wedding. It is a strategic corporate merger that will permanently solidify our family empire. They are building a dynasty. And you are a parasite. You are a disgusting, broke parasite desperately trying to latch onto my son to drain him of his future." It was a fascinating psychological display. Valerie was aggressively projecting her own family's parasitic nature directly onto me. She was accusing me of draining Terrence's future, completely oblivious to the fact that Terrence was the one who had been draining my bank accounts to fund his fake lifestyle. She spoke of Serena's capital and political connections with a ravenous hunger, exposing the desperate reality that the Vance family had absolutely nothing left of their own. They needed Serena's money to survive. They were the actual parasites frantically trying to latch onto a wealthy host before their entire house of cards collapsed into absolute bankruptcy. Valerie opened the top drawer of the mahogany desk with a sharp, aggressive jerk. She pulled out a pristine leather-bound checkbook and grabbed a heavy gold fountain pen. She flipped the checkbook open, her hands shaking slightly as she uncapped the pen. "I know exactly how people like you operate," Valerie sneered, her eyes fixed on the blank check. "You pretend to be so in love, so dedicated, so purely devoted to the man. But at the end of the day, people from your low-class background only care about one single thing: cold hard cash. You saw the luxury cars in our driveway. You saw the chandeliers. You saw the opportunity to extort us. And you took it. Well, congratulations, Nia. You win. You finally get your pathetic payout." She began to write rapidly on the check, the gold nib of the fountain pen scratching aggressively against the heavy paper. The sound was loud in the quiet study, a rhythmic scratching noise that perfectly underscored her desperate arrogance. I watched her write, my face completely impassive. I analyzed the situation with the cold precision of a corporate executive evaluating a hostile takeover. Valerie was attempting a buyout. She was trying to purchase my silence and force my immediate resignation from Terrence's life using a severely overdrawn bank account. Valerie finished writing, capped the gold pen with a loud snap, and tore the check from the booklet. She held it between her manicured fingers for a brief moment, making sure I could see the numbers written across the front. Then, with a dramatic, highly condescending flourish, she slid the check across the polished mahogany desk. It glided over the smooth wood and stopped exactly at the edge, hovering just inches away from my hands. $10,000, Valerie announced, her voice dripping with extreme, sickening superiority. "That is more money than you have probably ever seen in your entire miserable life. That is more than your pathetic little hair care business will make in a decade. I am being incredibly generous with you, Nia. I am giving you a life-changing amount of money to simply do what you should have done the moment you realized you were completely out of your league." I looked down at the small piece of paper resting on the edge of the mahogany desk. $10,000. It was a laughable, entirely insignificant sum. My venture capital firm Obsidian Holdings routinely executed multi-million-dollar acquisitions before lunch. The watch I usually wore on my left wrist, currently locked safely in my apartment to maintain my poor disguise, cost 3 times the amount she had just aggressively slid across the table. But to Valerie, this check was a weapon. She believed it was a massive display of wealth that would instantly force me into submission. "Take this check and disappear!" Valerie snarled, stepping around the desk to close the physical distance between us. She pointed a sharp, accusing finger directly at my face. "You will not go back into that dining room. You will not speak another word to my son. You will not text him, call him, or look in his general direction ever again. You will turn around right now, walk straight down this hallway, and exit through the back door with the rest of the hired catering staff. You will leave this property immediately, and you will forget the name Vance completely." She crossed her arms over her chest, projecting an image of absolute, untouchable authority. "If you ever try to contact Terrence again, or if you ever breathe a single word about tonight to anyone in Atlanta, Winston will unleash the full force of his law firm upon you. We will bury you in endless litigation. We will ensure you never find employment in this city again. We will crush your pathetic little business and leave you absolutely destitute. Do you understand me clearly? Take the money, walk out the back door, and never return." I stood perfectly still, letting her aggressive threats wash over me like useless, empty air. She was threatening me with a law firm that was currently functionally insolvent. She was demanding I leave through the servant's entrance while writing a check from an account that I knew for a fact was bleeding cash. It was the absolute pinnacle of arrogant delusion. I slowly reached out my hand and picked up the check. The paper felt crisp and new between my fingers. I looked at the numbers written in Valerie's looping, aggressive handwriting. $10,000. A literal drop in the bucket of my actual net worth. A completely worthless piece of paper from a family drowning in massive unpayable debt. A faint, completely unreadable smile touched the corners of my lips. It was not a smile of gratitude. It was not a smile of submission. It was the deeply satisfied smile of an apex predator who had just successfully lured her prey into an inescapable, perfectly constructed trap. Valerie had just given me the ultimate piece of physical evidence. She had put a literal price tag on her own family's arrogant cruelty. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance," I said, my voice smooth, calm, and perfectly controlled. I appreciate you making your position so incredibly clear. This check tells me absolutely everything I need to know about how your family operates. Valerie smirked, her shoulders relaxing as she falsely assumed she had successfully won the battle. I knew you were just a common gold digger. Now take your money and get out through the back door. Do not let Serena see you leaving. I carefully folded the $10,000 check exactly in half and slipped it into the deep pocket of my stained catering apron. I did not break eye contact with Valerie. Her smug, victorious expression was firmly locked into my memory. I wanted to remember exactly how arrogant she looked in this specific moment, so I could savor the inevitable contrast when her entire world collapsed into absolute ruin later tonight. I turned around gracefully and placed my hand on the heavy brass door handle. I unlocked the double doors and pulled them open, stepping out of the oppressive smoke-scented study and back into the brightly lit gilded hallway. The back door is through the kitchen, Nia. Valerie snapped impatiently from behind me, clearly annoyed that I was not moving fast enough. Do not get lost in my house. I did not turn around to look at her. I simply adjusted the crisp collar of my thrift store dress, smoothed my hands over the front of the stained white apron, and began walking down the corridor. But I did not turn left toward the bustling, chaotic kitchen. I did not walk toward the servants' entrance to quietly disappear into the night like a defeated, obedient stray dog. Instead, I turned right. I stepped purposefully down the dark hallway that ran directly behind the main living quarters, moving away from the kitchen and toward the grand foyer. I had zero intention of leaving this house. The true climax of the evening had not even begun. I walked softly against the plush runner rug, my mind calculating the exact timing required for my next corporate maneuver. I needed a few quiet moments to execute the final financial strike that would seal their fate forever. As I moved quietly through the shadows, my ears picked up the sound of hushed, aggressive voices coming from an alcove just ahead. I slowed my pace, my corporate instincts instantly flaring on high alert. The voices belonged to Terrence and Dr. Julian. They had stepped away from the dining table to engage in a private, deeply panicked conversation. I stopped walking and pressed my back flat against the cool wallpaper, slipping entirely into the darkness of the hallway. I held my breath and listened closely, ready to uncover the darkest, most terrifying secrets the Vance family was desperately trying to hide. I pressed my spine against the cool wallpaper, willing my breathing to slow to a silent rhythm. The alcove was positioned perfectly, a small indentation designed for displaying marble busts, but right now it served as the ultimate listening post. Just a few feet away, obscured by a heavy velvet curtain tied back with gold tassels, Terrence and Dr. Julian stood aggressively invading each other's personal space. The confident, arrogant men who had sat at the dining room table mocking my homemade hair care business were entirely gone. In their place stood two terrified, desperate frauds hyperventilating in the dim hallway light. Julian was gripping the lapels of Terrence's suit jacket, his knuckles white against the dark fabric. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Julian hissed, his voice vibrating with a frantic, unhinged energy. "What is taking you so incredibly long? You told Winston and me that you would secure the engagement ring and officially lock Serena down by the end of last week. We are completely out of time, Terrence. We are drowning." Terrence shoved Julian's hands off his chest, smoothing down his jacket with trembling fingers. "Keep your voice down," Terrence snapped, glancing nervously toward the dining room doors. "I am handling it. Serena is a highly demanding woman. She requires a massive theatrical buildup before I can drop a proposal. If I rush the timeline, her father will smell blood in the water. That real estate tycoon does not hand over a single dime without running a background check. We have to make it look like a seamless merging of equals, not a desperate bailout. A desperate financial bailout." The words hung heavily in the narrow corridor. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, committing the exact phrasing to my permanent mental ledger. My corporate instincts were screaming now. A seamless merging of equals. Julian mocked bitterly, running a sweaty hand over his face. He paced in a tight, agitated circle, looking like a man standing on the edge of a towering cliff. "There are no equals here, Terrence. We have nothing left. Aesthetic pinnacle is bleeding out on the operating table. Do you have any idea how much those 3 consecutive malpractice lawsuits are going to cost me to settle out of court? I botched a high-profile client's facial reconstruction last month because I was too stressed to focus on the scalpel. My medical license is currently hanging by a fraying thread. Julian let out a ragged, desperate breath, leaning his head back against the paneled wall. Chloe keeps bragging to everyone about buying a luxury vacation home in Aspen. She just ordered $50,000 worth of custom furniture for a chalet that does not exist. She has no idea that our primary residence in Buckhead is 2 months behind on the mortgage. If your future father-in-law does not inject an immediate $2 million of capital into my clinic by next Friday, the venture capitalists are going to seize everything. I will be publicly ruined. I will go to federal prison for medical fraud. I listened with cold clinical detachment. Julian, the arrogant plastic surgeon who had just gleefully offered me trash bags full of charity clothing, was a borderline criminal actively committing medical malpractice. He was hiding massive career-ending lawsuits behind a desperate facade of surgical brilliance. His wife, Chloe, was spending phantom money on non-existent real estate to impress women she secretly hated. The terrifying magnitude of their collective delusion was staggering. "Your clinic is not the only asset on fire," Terrence shot back, his voice dropping into a harsh, angry whisper. "Do not act like you are the only one carrying the heavy weight of this entire family. Have you seen the accounting ledgers for Vance and Associates recently? Dad is completely losing his grip on reality. He keeps pitching multi-million-dollar corporate acquisitions to mask the fact that his law firm has not successfully closed a major profitable deal in over 14 months. Terrence stepped closer to Julian, jabbing a finger into his brother-in-law's chest. "Winston's senior partners are jumping ship. The firm is functionally insolvent. We have outstanding loans with aggressive creditors who do not care about the historic Vance family legacy. If I do not marry Serena and gain immediate access to her father's massive real estate trust fund, the firm will collapse before the end of the fiscal quarter. Dad will be disbarred for gross financial negligence. Do you understand the intense pressure I am under? I have to romance a woman I despise just to keep my own father out of a federal penitentiary." The dark puzzle was now entirely complete. Winston, the pompous patriarch, who had aggressively lectured me about associating exclusively with the absolute highest echelon of society, was presiding over a dead law firm. He was bankrupting his enemies he had claimed at the dinner table. In reality, he was the one actively being bankrupted. His entire identity, his untouchable elite status, was built on a mountain of unpaid debt. "You despise Serena," Julian asked, a bitter, humorless laugh escaping his throat. "You could have fooled me. You were practically drooling all over her emerald dress in the foyer. You look like a man entirely thrilled to marry into a prominent, filthy rich family." "I am playing the required game." Terrence sneered, a deep vein of authentic hatred pulsing through his hushed voice. "Serena is an entitled, insufferable nightmare. She treats everyone around her like garbage. She demands constant, exhausting worship. I cannot stand listening to her talk about her expensive trips and her daddy's portfolio. But she is my absolute only ticket out of this catastrophic mess. Her father's real estate capital is the only clean money large enough to silently erase the massive deficits at the law firm and your failing clinic. I am sacrificing my personal freedom to save our precious black excellence facade." "Then what on earth are you doing bringing Naya here tonight?" Julian demanded, his voice laced with genuine frantic confusion. "If Serena is your golden ticket, why would you actively risk enraging her by parading your cheap, poor girlfriend around the dining room? It is a completely unnecessary, highly dangerous risk. Serena already looks like she wants Nia to scrub the baseboards." "I did not invite her," Terrence hissed defensively, rubbing his temples in aggressive frustration. "Mom forced my hand. Valerie wanted to use Nia as a human prop to make Serena feel superior. Mom thought that if Serena saw a broke, pathetic woman struggling in the kitchen, she would appreciate our family's wealth even more. It was a stupid, reckless power play by Mom, but I could not exactly tell her no without blowing my cover." Terrence let out a long, heavy sigh. Besides, Nia was always incredibly safe. She is simple. She mixes her little lotions and asks absolutely zero difficult questions. I kept her around these past 8 months because she was cheap and highly predictable. I needed a low-maintenance distraction while I spent all my actual energy orchestrating this massive financial merger with Serena. Nia does not care about money because she has never had any. She is completely harmless. I figured I would just string her along until the engagement to Serena was locked in, then quietly dump her. I stood perfectly motionless in the shadows, letting his vile sociopathic words wash over me. He did not just use me. He viewed my manufactured poverty as an exploitable asset. He thought my supposed lack of wealth made me an easy disposable target. He believed I was a simple, stupid woman, incapable of understanding the corporate fraud happening right under my nose. Julian shook his head, running a hand through his perfectly styled, though now slightly messy hair. Well, you need to get rid of her tonight. Valerie already handed her a buyout check. If Nia goes running to Serena crying about a relationship, the real estate money vanishes and we all go to prison. Do whatever it takes, Terrence. Just secure the engagement ring and put it on Serena's finger before midnight for good. My blood ran cold, but my mind was entirely consumed by sharp, calculating fire. Terrence and Julian had just mapped out their entire criminal enterprise in a drafty hallway. They had admitted to medical malpractice, corporate insolvency, financial fraud, and a transactional, entirely loveless marriage designed solely to steal capital. The absolute moral bankruptcy of the Vance family was staggering. They were not just arrogant snobs, they were desperate, dangerous con artists, hiding behind prestigious degrees and expensive tailored suits. And they had made the colossal, unforgivable mistake of inviting the chief executive officer of Obsidian Holdings right into the absolute center of their fragile, crumbling web. I remained perfectly silent, waiting in the dark, preparing myself for the next critical phase of their panicked conversation, ready to catch the final damning piece of evidence that would guarantee their total, irreversible destruction. The clinking of silverware against fine china resumed, replacing the heavy silence that Winston had just imposed. The conversation at the main table quickly pivoted back to aggressive bragging and strategic networking. Winston leaned across the massive table, enthusiastically pouring more of the vintage Bordeaux into Serena's crystal glass. He launched into a lengthy, pompous monologue about a recent corporate merger his law firm supposedly orchestrated, throwing around massive financial figures like cheap confetti. Julian nodded along enthusiastically, completely abandoning his earlier panic to play the role of the highly successful medical entrepreneur. Chloe was aggressively agreeing with everything Serena said, practically begging for the wealthy heiress to invite her to exclusive charity galas. And Terrence, the man who had claimed to love me just 24 hours ago, was actively mirroring Serena's body language. He leaned in incredibly close to her, lowering his voice to murmur private jokes that made her giggle delicately. I watched him effortlessly slide into the role of the wealthy, unbothered elite suitor. It was a masterful, sickening performance, but I knew the actual numbers hiding behind his perfectly tailored suit. I knew exactly how fragile his financial reality was because I was the one secretly propping it up. Julian let out a sharp, incredulous breath, shaking his head as if trying to physically dislodge the immense stress building inside his skull. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized his brother-in-law in the dimly lit corridor. "Wait 1 absolute minute," Julian whispered fiercely, his voice dropping into an even darker, more paranoid register. "If you are completely broke, and your bank accounts are severely overdrawn, how exactly did you afford Serena's engagement ring?" I saw the official invoice from the diamond broker sitting directly on Winston's desk yesterday afternoon. $8,000, Terrence, a flawless, 2-carat custom-cut diamond. You do not have $8,000 to your miserable name. Did you take out another predatory high-interest loan? Because if Serena's father runs a comprehensive financial background check before the wedding and sees a fresh, massive line of personal credit, this entire merger is instantly dead. He will know we are completely desperate. Terrence let out a low, arrogant chuckle. The sound was incredibly jarring, a smug, highly confident noise that echoed strangely in the narrow, shadowed hallway. He leaned casually against the floral wallpaper, casually adjusting his expensive silk tie, as if they were discussing a minor golf score rather than massive corporate fraud. "Relax, Julian. Terrence sneered, a sickeningly proud smile stretching across his handsome face. I am not an idiot. I did not take out a new personal loan. I did not trigger a single credit alert. I paid for the engagement ring straight out of a checking account. It was a completely clean, untraceable transaction. Julian stared at him, his brow furrowing in deep, genuine confusion. Whose checking account? Winston has absolutely zero liquid capital left. My clinic accounts are currently frozen pending the malpractice litigation. Valerie's socialite charity funds are completely tapped out. Where on earth did you get $8,000 in pure liquid cash? Terrence's smile widened into a grotesque, predatory grin. I did not say I used my checking account. I used Nia's debit card. The air in the hallway seemed to freeze entirely. I stood pressed flat against the wall, my breathing slowing to an absolute minimum. I listened with clinical, unwavering focus as the man I had dated for 8 months proudly confessed to a major federal felony. Are you completely out of your mind? Julian hissed, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror. He grabbed Terrence by the shoulder, shaking him roughly. You committed identity theft. You stole a credit card to buy an engagement ring for another woman. If Nia finds out and goes to the Atlanta Police Department, you will go to federal prison for grand larceny. You are risking our entire family legacy on a stolen piece of plastic. She is not going to the police. Terrence laughed, swatting Julian's hand away with supreme arrogant dismissal. You are giving that pathetic woman way too much credit. She is completely clueless. A few weeks ago, she left her cheap little purse in the passenger seat of my car while she ran into the grocery store. I took her debit card, snapped clear photos of the front and back, and quietly put it right back into her wallet before she returned. Last Tuesday, I linked her card details to an anonymous online payment portal and completely drained her account. I took exactly $8,000. It was an incredibly smooth, flawless transfer directly to the diamond broker. Julian looked physically sick, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. You drained her account. What if she notices the missing funds? What if she alerts her bank? Terrence rolled his eyes, utterly unbothered by the criminal severity of his actions. Of course she will notice the missing funds eventually. I took every single penny she had. That $8,000 was obviously her entire meager life savings from selling those pathetic homemade lotions. But it absolutely does not matter if she notices. What exactly is she going to do about it? She is completely broke now. She cannot afford to hire an attorney. She does not have the resources to fight a prominent, wealthy family like ours. If she tries to make a public scene, my father will bury her in aggressive legal threats. We will claim she willingly bought the ring as a gift because she is mentally unstable and delusionally obsessed with me. The local authorities will look at a powerful logistics executive and a poor, uneducated street vendor, and they will laugh her right out of the police precinct. Terrence crossed his arms, basking in his own fabricated brilliance. I targeted her specifically because she is an easy, defenseless mark. She is too stupid to understand complex financial transfers, and she is too poor to demand basic justice. I essentially liquidated a parasite to secure our family's multi-million-dollar future. You should be thanking me, Julian. I just saved your failing medical clinic using a broke woman's petty cash. I stood perfectly still in the darkness. I did not burst into tears. I did not gasp in horror. I did not feel the sudden crushing weight of a broken heart. Emotional reactions are for people who do not possess the immense power to destroy their enemies. I operated on a completely different frequency. My business instincts, honed by years of ruthless corporate acquisitions and high-stakes venture capital negotiations, completely took over my entire physical body. I was no longer a betrayed girlfriend. I was a chief executive officer, actively neutralizing a severe security threat. Terrence had just boldly admitted to committing wire fraud, grand larceny, and felony identity theft. He had proudly detailed his exact criminal methodology, his specific timeline, and his malicious predatory intent. He genuinely believed that stripping away $8,000 would leave me utterly destitute and entirely incapable of fighting back. The sheer monumental irony of his assumption was almost poetic. The debit card Terrence had so proudly photographed and drained did not hold my life savings. It was a low-tier secondary checking account I strictly maintained for purchasing trivial daily items like morning coffee, minor groceries, and cheap thrift store dresses to maintain my modest disguise. The $8,000 he stole was absolutely nothing. It was literal pocket change. However, the federal crime he committed to steal that pocket change carried a mandatory minimum prison sentence. He had handed me the ultimate undeniable weapon to execute him legally. I slid my hand smoothly into the deep pocket of my stained catering apron and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated my face with a faint cold blue light. I did not tremble. I did not hesitate. My thumbs moved across the digital keyboard with blinding, lethal precision. First, I immediately opened my secure private banking application. I navigated directly to the secondary checking account Terrence had compromised. I downloaded the entire transaction history, capturing the exact timestamp, the digital routing numbers, and the specific merchant identification code for the diamond broker. I took high-resolution screenshots of the fraudulent $8,000 transfer. I then securely locked the debit card permanently, freezing the account to prevent any further unauthorized activity. The digital evidence was now permanently sealed, perfectly preserved for the fraud division of the Atlanta Police Department. Second, I exited the banking application and opened a highly specialized military-grade encrypted communication portal exclusively reserved for Obsidian Holdings' executive operations. I bypassed the standard security protocols using my biometric fingerprint, instantly accessing the central financial nervous system of my multi-million-dollar empire. I initiated a direct, high-priority communication line to Elias, my incredibly ruthless and highly efficient chief financial officer. The message I typed was concise, devoid of emotion, and highly destructive. Elias, I need immediate aggressive corporate action. Initiate a comprehensive financial sweep on two specific entities located in Atlanta. Target 1 is Vance & Associates, a corporate law firm managed by Winston Vance. Target 2 is Aesthetic Pinnacle, a private surgical clinic managed by Dr. Julian. Both entities are currently functionally insolvent and desperately seeking emergency venture capital bailouts. I want you to locate their outstanding corporate debt immediately. If Obsidian Holdings or any of our subsidiary branches currently own their loans, I want those loans called in for immediate full repayment tonight. Furthermore, issue a permanent system-wide blackout on both entities. Veto any pending capital applications they have submitted to our network. Block their access to all secondary financial markets under our corporate umbrella. I want their credit lines severed, their assets frozen, and their operational liquidity completely drained before the stock market opens tomorrow morning. Acknowledge receipt and execute immediately. I hit the send button. The encrypted application flashed a bright green confirmation checkmark. The financial guillotine was officially released, and the heavy razor-sharp blade was currently falling rapidly toward the Vance family's exposed, fragile necks. Elias was a legendary financial predator. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He did not request emotional context. Within 30 seconds, a brief, highly satisfying response appeared on my glowing screen. Directive received, Chief Executive Officer. Locating target debt profiles now. Execution of total asset freeze will be completed within the next 12 minutes. They will be entirely bankrupt before they serve dessert. I locked my phone screen, sliding the device safely back into my apron pocket. The feeling of absolute, uncontested power rushing through my veins was incredibly intoxicating. Terrence and Julian were still standing just a few feet away, whispering frantically about their upcoming merger with Serena's real estate tycoon father. They were aggressively planning a wedding built entirely on stolen money and massive corporate fraud. They thought they were the smartest, most elite men in the entire city. They thought they had successfully outmaneuvered the system by preying on a woman they deemed weak and insignificant. They had absolutely no idea that their entire generational legacy had just been brutally eradicated by a single encrypted email sent from a dark hallway. The massive, towering fortress of black excellence they constantly bragged about was actually a fragile house of cards, and I had just gleefully set the foundational pillars completely on fire. "All right, listen to me closely, Terrence," whispered harshly, gripping Julian's shoulder to emphasize his absolute authority. You need to go back into the dining room right now. Put on a bright smile, pour yourself another glass of expensive wine, and act like the highly successful plastic surgeon you're supposed to be. I am going to head back in there and smoothly orchestrate this final engagement push. Once I secure Serena's definitive yes, her father's capital will flow directly into our accounts by Monday morning. We just have to survive this one dinner. Do not panic. Do not sweat. Just play the game. Julian nodded quickly, taking a deep, shuddering breath to steady his visibly frayed nerves. Okay, you are right. We can do this. We just have to survive tonight. I will go back in and distract Winston and Valerie while you handle Serena. I pressed myself deeper into the dark, shadowy alcove as Julian turned around and marched quickly back toward the brightly lit dining room. Terrence remained in the hallway for a few seconds longer. He pulled out his own phone, likely checking his stolen bank balance or admiring the receipt for the engagement ring he had fraudulently purchased. A sickeningly confident, deeply arrogant smile stretched across his face. He adjusted his expensive silk tie one final time, completely ready to return to the grand table and play the role of the wealthy, unbothered elite. I waited until Terrence began walking back toward the dining room before I finally moved from my hidden position. The hallway eavesdropping had yielded a flawless, undisputed victory. I had uncovered their dark criminal motives. I had secured hard, undeniable evidence of felony identity theft. I had successfully initiated a multi-million-dollar corporate strike that would leave them entirely destitute within minutes. The brutal, quiet preparation phase was completely over. It was time for the execution. It was time for me to return to the dining room and watch my flawless trap violently snap shut. I reached back and grabbed the thick cotton strings tied tightly around my waist. With one sharp, decisive pull, I completely undid the knot. I slipped the stained white catering apron off my shoulders and let it fall carelessly onto the expensive Persian rug runner lining the hallway floor. The heavy fabric landed with a soft, muted thud, symbolizing the absolute end of my fabricated submission. I smoothed down the front of my simple floral thrift store dress, adjusting the neckline with perfect, unbothered composure. I was no longer playing the role of the submissive, intimidated girlfriend, desperately seeking the approval of a high society family. I rolled my shoulders back, lifted my chin, and began walking purposefully toward the golden light spilling out from the grand dining room. My footsteps were completely silent, but my presence was about to detonate like a massive corporate bomb. As I approached the wide archway, the booming, arrogant voice of Winston Vance echoed off the crystal chandeliers. He had firmly positioned himself at the absolute head of the massive mahogany table, holding his delicate wineglass high in the air. The catering staff had quietly retreated to the edges of the room, standing like invisible statues while the patriarch held his grand court. Terrence was sitting rigidly next to Serena, his fake handsome smile plastered perfectly across his face, acting exactly like the triumphant heir to an untouchable legal dynasty. Julian and Chloe leaned forward with sickeningly eager expressions, completely buying into the theatrical performance. Winston puffed out his chest, projecting his voice with the practiced cadence of a seasoned courtroom litigator. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate not just a beautiful dinner, but the glorious, undeniable future of our two families, Winston declared loudly. The Vance family has spent generations meticulously cultivating a legacy of absolute, untouchable elite status. We are the titans of Atlanta. We forge paths that ordinary people can only dream of walking. And tonight, looking at my brilliant son Terrence sitting beside the incredibly radiant Serena, I see the ultimate continuation of that profound excellence. This is a union of immense power. It is a seamless merging of two legendary empires that will permanently dictate the financial and social landscape of this entire state. We only align ourselves with the absolute best. We reject mediocrity in all its pathetic forms. To Terrence and Serena, the absolute future of Black excellence. Hear, hear! Julian cheered loudly, raising his own glass with desperate enthusiasm, trying to secure his own proximity to Serena's immense real estate wealth. I stepped out of the shadows of the archway and walked directly into the brightly lit dining room. I did not tiptoe back to the wobbly wooden stool in the dark corner. I marched straight toward the main table, stopping directly across from Winston. The sudden movement caught the attention of the entire room. Winston froze, his crystal wineglass hovering awkwardly in the air. His pompous smile instantly curdled into a mask of pure, unfiltered outrage. Serena let out a sharp, highly offended gasp, clearly appalled that the hired help had dared to interrupt such a prestigious, wealthy toast. I reached into the pocket of my dress and pulled out the crisp, neatly folded check Valerie had aggressively written for me just minutes ago in the private study. I pinched it firmly between my index and middle fingers, holding it up high so the bright light from the crystal chandelier illuminated the blue ink and the bold, $10,000 figure. Valerie saw the piece of paper and her eyes nearly bulged completely out of her perfectly contoured face. The sheer, unadulterated panic of having her secret underhanded bribery exposed in front of Serena caused her to instantly lose all remaining composure. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Valerie screamed, her shrill voice slicing through the elegant dining room like a rusty blade. She stood up so violently that her heavy dining chair tipped backward, crashing loudly onto the hardwood floor. "You shameless, disgusting little girl! How dare you walk back into this room? I gave you extremely explicit instructions to leave my property immediately. You are an absolute embarrassment to yourself and everyone around you. Security should be dragging you out by your hair." Terrence squeezed his eyes shut, rubbing his forehead as if he were suffering a massive, sudden migraine. "Dad, please just call the police," Terrence begged weakly, his cowardly voice trembling. "She is completely unhinged. She is trying to ruin everything." I did not flinch at Valerie's screaming, nor did I react to Terrence's pathetic attempt to criminalize my presence. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Valerie. I lifted my hands, gripping the top edge of the $10,000 check. With slow, deliberate, and incredibly precise movements, I tore the thick paper directly down the middle. The sharp ripping sound was highly audible in the shocked silence of the room. Valerie gasped audibly, clutching her pearl necklace in sheer horror. I placed the two torn halves together and ripped them again. Then again. I continued tearing the paper with methodical, rhythmic precision until Valerie's desperate, arrogant buyout offer was reduced to a handful of tiny, meaningless scraps. I extended my arm directly over the center of the lavishly decorated dining table. I slowly opened my fingers and let the pieces fall. The tiny white squares of confetti fluttered gracefully through the air, raining down like cheap snow onto the expensive roasted quail, the pristine white linen tablecloth, and directly into Terrence's untouched wineglass. $10,000, I said, letting out a sharp, genuinely amused, incredibly cold laugh. The sound of my laughter seemed to deeply unsettle every single person sitting at the table. $10,000 to walk out the back door and disappear quietly into the night. Valerie, you really thought you were executing a masterful, high-level corporate buyout, did you not? You honestly believed you were flexing immense, undeniable wealth. My company generates this exact amount of profit every hour and a half before I even finish my morning coffee. Your entire supposedly elite financial arsenal is nothing but literal pocket change to me. For a brief, suspended moment, the entire dining room was trapped in a vacuum of stunned silence. Everyone stared at the tiny pieces of shredded check ruining their expensive, meticulously plated dinners. Then the tension broke, but not with fear or realization. It broke with a massive, explosive wave of vicious, mocking laughter. Chloe was the first to completely lose her composure. She threw her head back and let out a loud, obnoxious cackle, slapping her hand against Julian's arm. "Oh my actual goodness!" Chloe shrieked, tears of mirth forming in the corners of her eyes. "Did you all just hear what this crazy woman said? She thinks she makes $10,000 before breakfast. She actually believes she is some kind of massive corporate mogul. This is the funniest, most pathetic thing I have ever witnessed in my entire life." Julian joined in, his chest heaving with arrogant amusement as he pointed a mocking finger at me. "I told you," Terrence Julian wheezed, wiping his sweaty face. "I told you she was completely delusional. This is what happens when you bring absolute street trash into a multi-million-dollar household. They see our extreme wealth, their brains completely short-circuit, and they start hallucinating that they actually belong in the same tax bracket. She is probably standing there right now imagining she owns a private jet. Winston let out a deep, booming laugh from the head of the table, shaking his head with profound, theatrical pity. He looked at Serena, gesturing toward me as if I were a fascinating broken exhibit at a local zoo. "I deeply apologize for this absurd disruption," Serena Winston said, his tone dripping with thick condescension. "You have to understand people from her low class, uneducated demographic simply do not comprehend how real money actually works. To a woman who mixes cheap hair oils in her bathtub, $10,000 feels like an unimaginable fortune. She is desperately trying to project power because her fragile ego is entirely crushed by your superior presence. It is a classic, deeply pathetic defense mechanism. We will have the staff remove her immediately so we can continue our lovely evening." Terrence finally found his fake, arrogant courage bolstered entirely by his family's aggressive mockery. He stood up, squaring his shoulders, and looked down at me with supreme, unfiltered disgust. "Nia, you have officially lost your mind." Terrence sneered, his voice loud and performative for Serena's benefit. "You are standing here wearing a cheap, ugly thrift store dress, covered in cooking grease, and you are trying to convince a table full of elite doctors, prominent lawyers, and real estate tycoons that you are a secret millionaire. It is not just embarrassing anymore. It is clinically insane. I gave you the absolute privilege of stepping foot inside this mansion, and you repay me by throwing a psychotic tantrum over a check you desperately needed for rent. Get out of my father's house right now before I personally call security to drag you off the property." Valerie smiled victoriously from her end of the table, completely re-energized by the collective bullying. She crossed her arms over her chest, looking at the shredded pieces of the check with supreme satisfaction. "You should have taken the money when you had the chance, little girl," Valerie taunted smoothly. "Now you are leaving with absolutely nothing but your delusions. You will never, ever be one of us." I did not break my composure. I did not flinch at their vicious, unrelenting insults. I stood perfectly tall, my posture radiating an impenetrable, icy strength. Their mocking laughter echoed off the high walls, a loud, obnoxious symphony of pure, unadulterated arrogance. They were so incredibly confident in their fake superiority. They were entirely convinced that their expensive suits and large house made them completely invincible. They felt untouchable. I simply smiled back at them, a slow, predatory curving of my lips that caused the laughter at the table to slightly falter. They expected me to scream, to cry, to break down and run away in absolute shame. They expected me to flee the room and disappear into the night, just as Valerie had aggressively commanded. Instead, I stood my ground, my eyes sweeping over Winston, Julian, Valerie, and Terrence. I was actively memorizing the exact expressions of pure, arrogant joy on their faces, because I knew those expressions were about to be permanently, violently erased. Their laughter was the absolute perfect setup. It was the highest possible peak of their collective delusion. They had built their entire fragile universe on a foundation of massive debt lies and stolen credit cards, and they were currently cheering on the very precipice of their total destruction. I did not need to raise my voice to defend my net worth. I did not need to argue with cowards and frauds. I just needed to wait for the encrypted corporate systems to finish their automated sweeps. The financial blackout I had initiated in the dark hallway was currently executing its final lethal protocols. I kept my icy gaze locked entirely on Winston, silently counting down the remaining seconds in my head. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The trap was perfectly primed. The silence I offered them was not defeat. It was the calm, terrifying withdrawal of the ocean just before a massive tsunami annihilates the entire coastline. The uproarious laughter echoing off the dining room walls reached a deafening crescendo. Chloe was wiping tears of mirth from her heavily contoured cheeks, while Valerie clutched her stomach in theatrical amusement. Terrence leaned back in his chair, looking completely triumphant, fully believing he had successfully neutralized the pathetic threat I posed to his fragile empire. The entire Vance family was entirely consumed by their own fabricated superiority, completely unaware that the very foundation of their massive, heavily mortgaged estate was currently disintegrating beneath their expensive leather shoes. Then the sharp, piercing trill of a cell phone violently ruptured the symphony of their mockery. It was Winston's phone resting right next to his half-empty crystal goblet of vintage Bordeaux. The customized, imposing ringtone cut through the laughter like a sudden, aggressive siren. Almost simultaneously, a rapid, frantic series of high-priority text message alerts erupted from Dr. Julian's jacket pocket. The synchronized digital interruptions were incredibly jarring, immediately killing the jovial, arrogant mood at the mahogany table. Winston let out a deep huff of profound annoyance, glaring down at the glowing screen of his device. He clearly hated any disruption while he was holding court, especially in front of Serena. "I am so incredibly sorry for this rude interruption," Serena Winston apologized smoothly, offering the real estate heiress a tight, practiced smile. "It is my senior managing partner. He knows better than to call me during a private dinner, unless it is an absolute emergency regarding our upcoming corporate acquisition. I simply must take this. It will only be a brief moment. Please go right ahead," Serena replied gracefully, waving her manicured hand with a dismissive elegance. "Real estate and corporate law never sleep. My father takes calls during dinner all the time. It is simply the heavy burden of managing true wealth." Winston nodded proudly, preening under her validation. He picked up his phone, swiped the screen, and pressed the device to his ear with an air of absolute unbothered authority. Julian, meanwhile, had hastily pulled his own phone from his suit jacket. He ducked his head, shielding the screen with his hand as he frantically unlocked it to read the sudden barrage of urgent notifications. I remained standing near the center of the table, perfectly still, my eyes darting between the two men. The digital execution I had authorized from the dark hallway was officially making landfall. I watched with intense clinical fascination as the precise, devastating payload of my financial strike hit its intended targets. Julian was the very first to physically break. The arrogant, highly successful plastic surgeon who had just gleefully offered me trash bags full of discarded charity clothing suddenly stopped breathing. His eyes widened to an unnatural, terrifying size, scanning the glowing screen of his smartphone with frantic, desperate speed. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His hands began to tremble so violently that the phone nearly slipped from his sweaty grasp. He rapidly scrolled down the screen, his mouth opening and closing as he desperately tried to process the catastrophic information appearing in his emergency email inbox. "Julian." "What is it?" Chloe asked, her voice laced with sharp annoyance rather than genuine concern. She reached out to touch his arm, clearly irritated that he was ruining the perfect high society aesthetic of their dinner. "Are the contractors for the Aspen house bothering you again? Tell them we will review the custom furniture invoices on Monday." Julian did not look at his wife. He did not look at Serena. He stared blankly straight ahead, completely paralyzed by sudden, insurmountable terror. "The bailout." Julian stammered, his voice cracking into a high, weak pitch that sounded absolutely nothing like his usual arrogant tone. "The venture capital firm. They just sent an automated emergency notice. They pulled the funding." Chloe scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes and waving her hand dismissively. "What do you mean they pulled the funding? Just call the regional director tomorrow and yell at him. You are the sole chief of surgery at Aesthetic Pinnacle. They need your clinic's prestige just as much as we need their capital. Tell them we will take our highly exclusive business to a competing investment group." "They did not just pull the funding, Chloe," Julian yelled, his voice suddenly escalating into a raw, terrified shriek that violently startled everyone at the table. He slammed his phone down hard onto the mahogany surface, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger at the glowing screen. "Obsidian Holdings completely blacklisted us. They issued a system-wide denial of our financial applications. And because the bailout capital was officially denied, the secondary creditors received an automatic alert. The bank is aggressively calling in the massive business loans tonight." Julian grabbed his own hair, pulling at the expensive strands as he hyperventilated right in front of his elite family. "They are foreclosing on the clinic tomorrow morning." Julian gasped out, his chest heaving with sheer panic. "The commercial medical license is being suspended, pending a massive federal fraud audit. The malpractice settlements are due, and we have absolutely zero liquid cash to cover them. We are completely ruined, Chloe." Aesthetic pinnacle is dead. We are millions of dollars in the hole. Chloe stared at her husband, her heavy makeup suddenly looking like a clownish mask on her frozen, horrified face. She looked around the dining room, her eyes darting toward Serena, desperately trying to gauge the wealthy heiress's reaction to this explosive, utterly humiliating admission of poverty. Serena was sitting perfectly upright, her emerald green gown suddenly looking extremely out of place in a room that was rapidly devolving into a financial crime scene. She looked at Julian with profound, unshielded disgust, instantly recognizing the unmistakable stench of a desperate, failing businessman. Before Valerie could intervene to silence Julian and desperately save face in front of their VIP guest, a sharp, terrifying sound completely shattered the remaining tension in the room. The heavy crystal wine goblet slipped right through Winston's fingers. It hit the edge of the mahogany table, bounced off the polished wood, and plummeted directly onto the floor. The expensive glass shattered into hundreds of jagged, glittering pieces, sending dark vintage Bordeaux splashing violently across the pristine white baseboards and soaking deep into the expensive Persian rug. The spilled wine looked exactly like a massive pool of fresh blood seeping out from under Winston's chair. Winston Vance, the untouchable titan of Atlanta corporate law, sat completely paralyzed in his seat. The cell phone was still pressed tightly against his ear, but his arm was completely rigid, frozen in place by sheer, unadulterated shock. His jaw hung slack. His breathing was shallow and erratic. The pompous, arrogant patriarch who had just arrogantly boasted about crushing his enemies and dictating the financial flow of the state looked like he had just been physically struck by a speeding freight train. Valerie gasped, surging up from her chair and rushing toward her husband. She completely ignored the shattered glass and the spilled wine ruining her shoes. Winston, what is happening? Who is on the phone? Speak to me right now. Winston slowly lowered the phone from his ear. His hand was shaking just as violently as Julian's. He looked at the shattered crystal on the floor, then slowly lifted his hollow, devastated eyes to look at Terrence. The fierce, demanding light that usually burned in the senior partner's eyes was completely extinguished. "The acquisition," Winston whispered. His voice was incredibly hoarse, stripped entirely of its usual booming theatrical authority. It was a hollow, defeated sound that carried an immense weight of absolute finality. Terrence gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. "Dad, what about the acquisition? Did the buyers demand a lower valuation price? We can aggressively renegotiate the terms on Monday. I will personally handle the contract adjustments." Winston slowly shook his heavy head, looking incredibly old and deeply fragile. The buyers did not demand a lower price, Terrence. The buyers completely vanished. Obsidian Holdings just aggressively vetoed the entire purchase order. They executed a hostile blackout on all our pending corporate files. Winston gripped his chest, his breathing becoming increasingly labored as the catastrophic reality settled over his mind. Because the acquisition officially failed, our primary commercial lenders just executed the default clauses in our operating agreements. They froze all our operational liquidity. The payroll accounts are completely locked. The partner equity funds are seized. Vance and Associates is officially insolvent. We are bankrupt, Terrence. The firm is dead. The grand, opulent dining room instantly descended into absolute, unmitigated chaos. The facade of black excellence, the generations of untouchable elite status, the 3 generations of Spellman pedigree, it all evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a pathetic room full of broke, desperate frauds, panicking in their expensive designer clothing. Valerie let out a shrill, piercing scream, clutching her pearl necklace, as if someone was physically strangling her. "No. No, that is completely impossible. We are the Vance family. We do not go bankrupt. Winston, call the bank president right now. Call the local governor. You tell them who we are. You demand they reverse this immediately. We have massive charity galas to fund. We have a country club reputation to fiercely uphold." Winston buried his face in his trembling hands, completely ignoring his wife's hysterical demands. "It is entirely over, Valerie. The federal auditors are already sealing the corporate office doors downtown. We have nothing left. We are tens of millions of dollars in debt. Chloe burst into aggressive, hyperventilating sobs, violently pushing Julian away when he tried to comfort her. "Do not touch me, you miserable failure!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the vaulted ceiling. "You promised me we were buying the Aspen Chalet. You promised me Aesthetic Pinnacle was generating millions. You lied to me. I am going to be a laughingstock at the country club. My friends are going to mercilessly mock me for marrying a broke, fraudulent doctor." Terrence jumped up from his chair, his eyes darting frantically towards Serena. The wealthy real estate heiress was currently standing up, smoothing down her silk gown with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. She was looking at the Vance family like they were a pack of diseased, rabid animals. She instantly realized she had been aggressively lured into a trap. This entire lavish dinner, the expensive wine, the flattering compliments, it was all a highly orchestrated, desperate con to secure her father's capital and save this drowning family from federal prison. "Serena, please, you have to listen to me," Terrence begged, abandoning all his false swagger and physically reaching out to grab her arm. "This is just a temporary, minor cash flow issue. My father's firm is incredibly resilient. We just need a small, short-term capital injection to aggressively leverage our assets. If your father can just authorize the preliminary merger funds tonight, we can fix all of this by tomorrow morning." Serena viciously snatched her arm away from his grasp, her diamond rings flashing aggressively under the chandelier light. "Do not ever touch me, you pathetic, desperate scam artist," Serena snarled, her voice dripping with sheer venom. "You actually thought you could manipulate my family into bailing out your fraudulent, bankrupt empire. You brought me to this circus to use me as an emergency ATM. My father is going to personally ensure that you and your miserable family are permanently blacklisted from every single elite social and financial circle in this entire city." I stood perfectly still near the edge of the dining table, watching the magnificent explosive destruction unfold right in front of my eyes. The timing of the financial guillotine had been absolutely flawless. Elias had executed the corporate blackout with the exact ruthless precision I demanded. I looked at the tiny, shredded pieces of the $10,000 check still resting on the ruined dinner spread. Valerie had aggressively told me to take the money and disappear because I was a broke parasite holding her son back. Now, she was screaming hysterically at her husband while her daughter cried over fake Aspen real estate, and her son groveled pathetically at the feet of a woman who completely despised him. They were utterly broken. The massive towering pedestal they had aggressively placed themselves upon had just been violently kicked out from under their feet. They were falling rapidly into the dark, terrifying abyss of total financial ruin, and the impact was going to be absolutely devastating. The screaming continued, echoing loudly down the dark, expensive hallways of the Buckhead mansion. Terrence was still desperately pleading with Serena, begging her not to walk out the front door. Winston was sobbing into his hands. Julian was frantically dialing his phone, desperately trying to reach a lawyer who would not answer. It was a beautiful, chaotic masterpiece, and I had orchestrated every single second of it. I slowly reached my hand into my small, modest purse. My fingers brushed against the cold, solid metal of my corporate card. The Vance family thought the absolute worst part of their night was the sudden bankruptcy. They were entirely wrong. The bankruptcy was just the opening act. The true, absolute devastation was about to be delivered, and I was going to make sure they remembered my name for the rest of their miserable, destitute lives. I pulled my hand out of my small, modest purse. My fingers gripped the cold, solid metal of my corporate credit card. The grand dining room was still echoing with Serena's furious screams and the frantic, hyperventilating sobs of Valerie and Chloe. Terrence was desperately clinging to the edge of the mahogany table, looking like a man completely destroyed by his own hubris. Winston remained frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the spilled vintage Bordeaux that looked like a pool of fresh blood. Julian was practically tearing his own hair out, muttering incomprehensible apologies to a venture capital firm that had already abandoned him. They were all so entirely consumed by their sudden catastrophic financial ruin that they did not even notice me stepping forward. I walked directly to the center of the massive dining table, stopping right next to the shattered crystal glass Winston had dropped. I raised my right hand holding the heavy matte black metal card between my index and middle fingers. The card caught the bright light of the crystal chandelier, the engraved silver logo shining with unmistakable absolute corporate authority. I flicked my wrist and tossed the metal card directly onto the center of the polished mahogany table. It landed with a heavy, definitive, incredibly loud thud. The physical weight of the solid metal card hitting the wood was impossible to ignore. Every single person in the room instantly stopped screaming. The chaotic dining room plunged into an eerie, suffocating silence. Valerie choked on a sob, her eyes darting toward the table. Julian froze his hands, still clutching his messy hair. Terrence slowly lifted his head, his tear-stained face twisting in pure confusion as he looked at the black card resting next to the ruined appetizers. Winston, despite his profound state of shock, possessed the deep ingrained instincts of a corporate lawyer. His hollow eyes locked onto the metal card. He slowly leaned forward, his hands trembling violently, and squinted at the engraved silver lettering. He read the name of the venture capital firm that had just ruthlessly decimated his entire generational legacy. He read the name of the executive authorized to carry the highest-tier corporate account. His face, already pale from the bankruptcy alert, turned a sickening shade of translucent white. He looked up at me, his jaw trembling so uncontrollably that he could not form a single coherent word. "Good evening, Winston," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the dead silent room. "Good evening, Julian. I hope you are both paying very close attention right now." I took a slow, measured step back, allowing every person at the table to fully absorb the reality of my presence. I smoothed my hands down the sides of my simple, inexpensive floral dress, the exact same dress they had aggressively mocked just 20 minutes ago. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Obsidian Holdings." I announced, my words striking them with the lethal force of a physical blow. "Yes, Winston, I am the sole owner of the venture capital firm that just firmly denied your desperate, pathetic bailouts." The absolute silence in the room stretched until it felt like the air itself was shattering. Valerie let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp, stumbling backward until she hit the wall. Chloe covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Julian collapsed back into his chair, his legs completely giving out beneath him as the horrific realization washed over his face. "You." Winston choked out his voice, a raspy, broken whisper. He pointed a shaking, frail finger at me. "That is completely impossible. You are a street vendor. You make cheap lotions in your sink. You are wearing charity clothes. This is a sick, twisted prank." I smiled, a cold, predatory expression that completely stripped away the last remaining shreds of his fragile denial. "My little hair care hobby generated $50 million in pure revenue last year," I corrected him smoothly. "My investment division actively manages over $3 billion in global assets. And my corporate acquisition team was highly interested in purchasing your failing law firm right up until the exact moment you allowed your arrogant, foolish son to bring me into this house and treat me like a stray dog. You are officially bankrupt because I just ordered my executive board to violently reject your applications. I personally executed the financial strike that destroyed your entire family." Serena stopped dead in her tracks. She slowly turned around, her emerald green gown shimmering as she looked at me with an expression of profound, unfiltered awe. Then she looked down at Terrence. The final piece of the horrifying puzzle clicked perfectly into place in her mind. "You absolute miserable frauds," Serena whispered, her voice dripping with the kind of intense venom that only comes from deep personal humiliation. She walked slowly back toward Terrence, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "You did not just try to use my father's real estate capital to save your bankrupt family. You actively brought the chief executive officer of the very firm holding your execution orders to this dinner. You mocked a multimillionaire to her face while secretly begging her company for life-saving cash. You are not just completely broke, Terrence. You are the stupidest, most incredibly arrogant man I have ever met in my entire life." Terrence looked like his brain had completely short-circuited. He stared at the heavy black metal card resting on the table, reading my name, engraved in elegant silver lettering. Nia Brooks, Chief Executive Officer, Obsidian Holdings. He read it over and over again, his lips moving silently as his mind desperately tried to reject the undeniable catastrophic reality. Nia Terrence stammered, his voice weak and pathetic. He slowly reached his hand out toward me, a desperate begging gesture that made my stomach churn with disgust. Baby, please. This has to be a mistake. You are my girlfriend. We are building a life together. You cannot do this to me. You cannot do this to my family. I let out a harsh, utterly humorless laugh. Do not ever call me that again, Terrence. We are not building anything together. You built a pathetic house of lies, and I just set it entirely on fire. You sat there all night and allowed your mother to hand me a catering apron. You sat there and allowed your sister to pour champagne on my shoes. You allowed your father to threaten me with legal action for simply asking about the $4,000 you aggressively begged me for last week. I took a step closer to him, towering over his pathetic, groveling form. And worst of all, Terrence, you thought you were incredibly smart. You proudly stood in the hallway with Julian and bragged about committing felony identity theft. You bragged about stealing my debit card to buy Serena an $8,000 engagement ring because you firmly believed I was too poor and too stupid to fight back. Serena gasped loudly in pure shock. You bought my ring with stolen money, she shrieked, looking at Terrence as if he were a disgusting crawling insect. You stole from a billionaire to buy me a cheap rock. I am going to have my father destroy whatever is left of your miserable, pathetic life. Terrence fell to his knees right there in the dining room. He dropped down onto the expensive Persian rug, completely ignoring the shards of shattered crystal and the spilled red wine soaking into his tailored trousers. He pressed his hands together in a desperate begging motion, tears streaming rapidly down his face. Nia, please. Terrence sobbed, his voice echoing with absolute raw desperation. Please, I am so incredibly sorry. I was under so much pressure. My father forced me to do it. He told me I had to secure Serena's money or the firm would fail. I love you. I really love you. You know I love you. Please just call your financial officer. Call them right now and tell them to reverse the blackout. You have the money. You can save us. Please, Nia, I will do anything. I will marry you tomorrow. We can merge our lives. I stared down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical revulsion. He was actually trying to offer me a marriage proposal while actively begging for a multi-million-dollar bailout. He was still trying to run a con, still desperately looking for an angle to exploit. He genuinely believed that his fake affection could somehow purchase my corporate mercy. I slowly reached out and picked up my heavy, matte black metal corporate card from the dining table. I wiped a tiny drop of spilled wine off the silver lettering using my thumb, then smoothly slid the card back into my modest purse. I stood tall and looked directly down at Terrence, preparing to deliver my final, absolute judgment. Before I could even speak a single word of my final judgment, a sharp, echoing crack violently shattered the heavy tension in the dining room. Serena had stepped forward and delivered a vicious, full-force slap directly across Terrence's tear-stained face. The sheer power behind the heiress's strike sent Terrence sprawling backward onto the ruined Persian rug. He clutched his rapidly reddening cheek, whimpering pathetically as he scrambled away from her towering, furious figure. "Do not you ever speak to me again, you miserable, lying parasite!" Serena screamed, her voice shaking the crystal fixtures above our heads. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Winston, then Valerie, and finally swept her hand across the entire ruined dining table. "You are all nothing but a pack of desperate, pathetic frauds. You brought me into this house, fed me cheap wine, and tried to manipulate my family into bailing out your massive, humiliating debts. You honestly thought my father would not uncover your insolvency before the ink on the marriage license dried. You thought you could trap me in a fake engagement to save yourselves from federal prison." She stepped closer to Winston, who visibly shrank back into his heavy dining chair. "My father will ensure that the Vance name becomes entirely synonymous with financial garbage." Serena snarled, her elite composure completely replaced by ruthless, vengeful fury. "By tomorrow morning, every single country club, charity board, and corporate partner in Atlanta will know exactly how broke and desperate you actually are. You are officially dead in this city." Without sparing a single glance back at the sobbing, pathetic mess of a man bleeding on the floor, Serena turned her back on the Vance family. She grabbed her exclusive designer bag, lifted the heavy hem of her emerald green silk gown, and marched straight out of the grand dining room. The heavy wooden front doors slammed shut moments later, shaking the very foundations of the mansion. The perfect corporate merger was officially destroyed. The massive real estate bailout was gone forever. The echoing slam of the front door acted as a horrifying starting pistol for Valerie. The matriarch of the Vance family, the woman who had proudly shoved a stained catering apron into my chest just 2 hours ago, completely snapped. Her carefully constructed facade of untouchable socialite superiority shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She let out a guttural, frantic sob and rushed around the edge of the mahogany table, stumbling carelessly over the broken shards of crystal glass. Valerie threw herself toward me, her hands shaking violently as she desperately reached out to grab my wrists. Tears streamed heavily down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup and leaving dark, ugly streaks across her cheeks. "Nia, please!" Valerie wailed, her voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. "Please, you have to listen to me. I was completely wrong. I was so incredibly foolish and entirely blinded by my own stress. You are the perfect woman for my son. You are exactly the kind of brilliant, powerful, beautiful partner he desperately needs. You are our true daughter. I see that now. We welcome you into this family with wide open arms." I looked down at her grasping, frantic hands. I felt a sudden surge of pure, unfiltered physical revulsion. I aggressively swatted her hands away, striking her wrists hard enough to make her stumble backward in profound shock. "Do not ever attempt to touch me again, Valerie," I commanded, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy register. "You do not get to call me your true daughter simply because my net worth can magically save you from living in a cardboard box on the street. Just an hour ago, you aggressively backed me into a corner and handed me a worthless $10,000 check from a severely overdrawn bank account. You proudly called me a broke nobody. You called me a vicious parasite holding your precious son back. You demanded I leave through the servants' entrance because I was not fit to breathe your elite air." Valerie shook her head frantically, tears flying from her face as she backed away. "I was just protecting him. I am a mother. I was trying to secure his future. I did not know who you actually were. If I had known you were a highly successful chief executive officer, I would have treated you with absolute respect. And that is exactly why your entire family is currently burning to the ground," I replied, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "You only respect money. You only value human beings based on the capital they can blindly provide for your selfish lifestyle. You treat working-class people like absolute garbage because you truly believe your fake pedigree makes you invincible. Well, Valerie, your glorious pedigree just completely bounced. Your elite sorority sisters cannot pay your massive mortgage, and your precious country club reputation will absolutely not keep your husband out of a federal courtroom." I turned my sharp, calculating gaze away from the sobbing matriarch and focused entirely on the two men still frozen in their respective chairs. Winston was clutching his chest, taking short, painful, shallow breaths as the monumental magnitude of his total financial execution finally set in. He looked completely hollowed out, a broken shell of the pompous patriarch who had aggressively mocked my intelligence just moments prior. "Winston," I said clearly, ensuring he heard every single syllable of his final judgment. "You proudly boasted that your law firm only associates with multi-million-dollar corporations. You love telling everyone how you ruthlessly bankrupt your enemies. My corporate acquisition team actually reviewed your portfolio last month. We saw the massive gaping holes in your accounting. We saw the desperate fraudulent maneuvers you used to hide your insolvency. I was actually going to authorize a generous buyout to save your innocent employees' jobs. But after witnessing how you raised your son and how you gleefully participate in the aggressive degradation of working women, I realized your firm was a highly toxic asset. You are not a titan of Atlanta. You are a negligent, desperate old man who just lost absolutely everything because of his own blinding arrogance." Winston squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a weak, pathetic groan that rattled in his throat. He did not even attempt to defend himself. The fight was completely drained from his aging body. Next, I locked eyes with Dr. Julian. The plastic surgeon was practically hyperventilating his expensive suit jacket soaked in nervous, terrified sweat. "And you, Julian," I continued smoothly, stepping slightly closer to his side of the table. "You confidently offered me trash bags full of charity clothing. You laughed loudly while your horrible wife poured sticky champagne on my shoes. I sincerely hope you actually save those charity clothes for yourself. When the bank aggressively seizes Aesthetic Pinnacle tomorrow morning, and the state medical board rapidly revokes your surgical license for massive malpractice fraud, you are going to need a fresh wardrobe for your numerous court appearances." Chloe let out a high, piercing shriek of pure despair, burying her face violently against Julian's shoulder. Julian just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, utterly unable to formulate a single coherent excuse for his disgusting behavior. Finally, I shifted my full attention back down to the floor where Terence was still kneeling in the spilled wine and shattered glass. The man who had confidently walked me into this mansion expecting me to quietly absorb his family's horrific abuse was now completely reduced to a begging, sniveling mess. "Nia, please." Terence whimpered, crawling slightly forward on his knees, his hands clasped together in desperate, pathetic prayer. "I will completely change. I promise you I will do whatever you want. I will spend the rest of my entire life making this up to you. Just give me one more chance. Call your financial officer right now. Reverse the blackout. Please, Nia, you are completely breaking my heart." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical satisfaction. He was still actively trying to play the victim, still desperately trying to use fake emotional leverage to extract a multi-million-dollar financial favor. It was the absolute peak of arrogant sociopathic manipulation. "I am not breaking your heart, Terence," I said, my voice ringing with total unyielding authority. "I am simply executing the devastating consequences of your own criminal actions." I took one deliberate step closer, towering over his kneeling, pathetic form. "You thought you were a brilliant criminal mastermind standing in that hallway. You actively bragged to Julian about cloning my debit card. You proudly confessed to draining $8,000 because you thought it was my life savings and that I was completely powerless to fight back." Terence froze entirely, his tearful eyes widening in sudden raw panic as he finally realized exactly what I was saying. The blood completely drained from his already pale face. "By the way, Terence," I said, looking down at him with a lethal, icy smile, "while I was standing in the shadows listening to your pathetic confession, I did not just freeze my bank accounts. I pulled the complete transaction history, secured the routing numbers, and precisely documented the exact merchant codes you used to buy Serena's ring. I just forwarded the IP logs of your $8,000 credit card theft directly to the Atlanta Police Department's fraud division." Terence let out a choked, horrifying gasp, violently clutching his stomach as if I had physically stabbed him. He collapsed forward onto the wet floor, completely broken. "The digital evidence is entirely irrefutable." I continued, my voice calm, steady, and utterly destructive. "Identity theft and grand larceny are incredibly serious federal felonies. You are not just facing total bankruptcy and massive public humiliation anymore. You are facing mandatory, minimum prison time. Have absolute fun explaining your brilliant elite financial strategy to a federal judge." Terence curled into a pathetic, trembling ball on the ruined Persian rug, his expensive suit stained with vintage wine and his own tears. He was completely incapable of formulating a coherent response. The crushing weight of his impending criminal charges had finally broken the last remaining fragments of his false bravado. I looked past his shaking form and cast one final, sweeping glance across the grand dining room. The magnificent crystal chandeliers still sparkled brightly overhead, but the opulent space now felt like a beautifully decorated tomb. Winston remained entirely paralyzed in his heavy mahogany chair, his vacant eyes staring sightlessly at the shattered glass scattered across the hardwood floor. The arrogant patriarch who had aggressively dictated the financial flow of Atlanta was now just a terrified, broken old man waiting for the federal auditors to arrive. Valerie leaned heavily against the paneled wall, her hands covering her face as she sobbed uncontrollably, mourning the permanent loss of her precious country club status and her elite socialite identity. Julian and Chloe clung to each other in sheer, unadulterated panic, frantically whispering about frozen clinic accounts and seized assets. The impenetrable fortress of their highly fabricated black excellence had been entirely demolished. They had built a massive generational empire on a foundation of cruel manipulation, immense debt, and fraudulent entitlement. I had simply arrived and handed them the exact consequences they so desperately deserved. I adjusted the strap of my modest purse, feeling the solid, comforting weight of my corporate card safely tucked inside. I took a deep, cleansing breath, letting the chaotic sounds of their absolute despair wash over me one last time. I wanted to remember this precise moment forever. I turned my body slightly, addressing the entire room, with a voice that rang with crystal clear, unwavering authority. This magnificent table is reserved exclusively for the elite. Is it not? I asked perfectly, echoing the vicious, arrogant words Winston had barked at me earlier this evening. Well, my financial portfolio only saves businesses with actual ethics. Enjoy the view from the absolute bottom. Without waiting for a single response, I turned my back on the devastating wreckage of the Vance family. I walked out of the formal dining room, my posture perfectly straight and my head held high. I moved smoothly down the grand gilded hallway, passing the expensive oil paintings and antique vases that now represented nothing but seized collateral. I reached the towering oak front doors, grasped the heavy brass handle, and pulled it wide open. The crisp, cool night air of Buckhead immediately rushed into the stifling foyer, instantly clearing the suffocating stench of their desperate arrogance. I stepped out onto the sweeping stone porch. Behind me, I heard the frantic scrambling sounds of footsteps rushing across the marble floor. Terrence and Valerie burst through the doorway, their faces twisted in absolute panic. They stood on the massive porch, desperately calling my name, making one final pathetic attempt to beg for corporate mercy. I did not turn around. I did not acknowledge their desperate pleas. I continued walking gracefully down the wide stone steps, leaving them trapped in the horrific nightmare they had aggressively created. Terrence watched me walk down the long, circular driveway, his tear-filled eyes darting frantically toward the dark street. He fully expected me to walk all the way down the block to the beat-up 10-year-old Honda Civic he had been so deeply ashamed of driving earlier that evening. He genuinely thought he was watching a poor thrift store girlfriend march away into obscurity. He was entirely wrong. Just as I reached the heavy wrought iron gates of the estate, a sleek, pristine chauffeur-driven black Maybach quietly glided around the corner and pulled smoothly up to the curb. The heavy tinted windows reflected the bright streetlights like black mirrors. My personal driver, a highly trained security professional dressed in an impeccable tailored suit, immediately stepped out of the vehicle. He offered me a warm, respectful nod and opened the heavy rear passenger door. I paused for a fraction of a second and looked back at the sprawling mansion. Terrence and Valerie were standing completely frozen on the grand stone porch, their jaws hanging slack in absolute unfiltered shock. They stared at the luxury vehicle, finally realizing the true, astronomical magnitude of the wealth they had just maliciously insulted and violently lost. I offered them one final icy smile, stepped gracefully into the plush leather interior of the Maybach, and allowed the heavy door to close firmly behind me. As the powerful engine purred and the luxury vehicle accelerated smoothly down the dark tree-lined street, I leaned back against the comfortable seat and closed my eyes. The heavy, exhausting burden of my undercover disguise was officially lifted. I was finally heading home. 6 months later, the absolute destruction of the Vance family was entirely complete. The local news heavily covered the massive, humiliating downfall of Winston Vance. He was permanently disbarred for gross financial negligence and officially declared total personal bankruptcy. His sprawling Buckhead mansion was forcefully seized by the bank and quickly auctioned off to cover a fraction of his massive corporate debt. Dr. Julian faced equally devastating consequences. aesthetic pinnacle was permanently closed by federal auditors. His medical license was swiftly revoked, and his expensive clinical equipment was liquidated to settle multiple, massive malpractice lawsuits. Chloe was forced to move into a tiny, cramped apartment completely ostracized by the wealthy socialite friends she had spent years desperately trying to impress. Terrence pleaded guilty to federal identity theft and wire fraud. Because he was a first-time offender, he narrowly avoided federal prison, but he was currently serving 5 years of strict probation and performing mandatory daily community service picking up trash along the hot Atlanta highways. He was a convicted felon completely unemployable in the corporate logistics sector. Meanwhile, I sat comfortably in my spacious sunlit corner office at Obsidian Holdings. My assistant walked in and placed a freshly printed magazine on my massive glass desk. I looked down at the glossy cover of a major national business publication. A high-resolution photograph of me smiling confidently stared back, accompanied by a bold headline praising the massive, unstoppable success of my organic skincare empire and my ruthless, highly effective venture capital strategies. I had successfully dismantled a toxic, fraudulent legacy without compromising a single ounce of my personal integrity. I had absolutely thrived entirely on my own terms, proving once and for all that true excellence is built on genuine character, not stolen credit cards and fake designer suits.